Welcome to Sleep from History. Tonight, we wander past timbered shop fronts and candlelit windows where wet cobbles hold the day's gossip and a cathedral's stone breath hums like a lullaby. Bakers bank their embers, bell ropes thrum, a watchman's staff taps a slow rhythm in the lanes. Beyond the city gates, tapestry light spills from a great hall, and somewhere near the dais, a cap and bells tilts, wood coiled like a spring, ready to prick the pride of princes with a smile. Here's the reality check. You probably wouldn't last a week. This journey unfolds in two gentle chapters you can use as timestamps. What was city life like in the Middle Ages, and what was life actually like as a jester in the Middle Ages? We'll drift from markets and guild houses to courts and Christmas revels, listening for the soft truth hidden inside laughter. Before we float off, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these sleepy journeys into history, and drop your location and local time in the comments. We're building a gentle map of listeners across the world. Now, let's drift together into the Middle Ages, lantern-lit, rough-hewn tender. The night settles over a medieval city, and lanterns flicker like stars fallen to earth. The streets are narrow, cobbled, and uneven, lined with timber-framed houses that lean forward, as if whispering secrets to one another. In the distance, a cathedral towers its silhouette, sharp against a navy sky, a beacon for pilgrims and townsfolk alike. Bells chime from its spire, marking the evening hours, just as they have for centuries, calling bakers to finish their loaves and shopkeepers to bolt their shutters. Beneath those bells, life hums steady, chaotic, and deeply human. Medieval cities were bustling hubs of commerce, politics, and faith. To a traveler arriving from a quiet village, the sights would be overwhelming. Rows of merchant stalls, crammed with goods from across Europe, coins clinking in hands, calloused from farm work, and voices carrying accents from lands far away. There were governing councils and mayors, a tangle of laws and customs, and towering defensive walls, punctuated with gates and watchtowers. The city was not just a place to live, it was a fortress of opportunity, wealth, and culture. Yet for all its vibrancy, there was an edge of danger. Fires could rip through timber homes in hours. Disease stalked the streets, and crime was a shadow lurking behind every corner. The smell of the city was a story in itself. Imagine warm bread from the bakery mingling with the iron tang of a blacksmith's forge, the incense from a church altar wafting through the open door, and the less pleasant odor of livestock refuse, and humanity crowded together. Pigs roamed alleyways, hens clucked in courtyards, and horses clattered over cobblestones, pulling carts heavy with trade goods. This was the lifeblood of medieval commerce markets that stretched for blocks, selling spices from the East woolen cloth from England and fine wines from France. Amid this energy, there was order, though it often felt fragile. Watchmen patrolled with staffs, lighting torches as night fell. Guilds managed trade and quality, while city councils enforced taxes and rules. The church's influence was everywhere. Bells rang, for mass clerics moved through crowds, and grand cathedrals loomed as both sanctuaries and symbols of power. Cities were places of contrast, luxury beside poverty, stone cathedrals beside timber shacks, opportunity beside peril. Yet for many medieval people, the city was a dream. Here was a place to escape the rigid life of a manor, to reinvent oneself as a craftsman, merchant, or even a scholar. Universities were sprouting in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, attracting students eager to learn law, medicine, and theology. Inns and taverns offered warmth and camaraderie, their smoky halls alive with laughter and music. Festivals transformed streets into rivers of color, banners fluttering above parades of merchants and performers. If you close your eyes, you might hear the mingled sounds of a medieval evening, the chatter of tradesmen closing shop, the sharp strike of a bell announcing curfew, the bark of a dog guarding its master's goods. The city never truly slept, not even when the gates were locked and lanterns dimmed. Somewhere a baker kneaded dough by candlelight. Somewhere else a scholar pored over parchment, scratching ink under the flickering glow. And in the grand cathedral at the city's heart, monks chanted softly, their voices echoing through stone halls, built to outlast empires. This was the heartbeat of medieval Europe, a place where wealth and filth coexisted, where pilgrims and peasants shared the same narrow lanes, and where ambition could lift a farmer's son into a guildmaster's chair. The medieval city was a crucible of humanity's hopes and fears, glowing softly in the darkness of history, a reminder that even 800 years ago, cities pulsed with the same restless energy we know today. The night settles over a medieval city, and lanterns flicker like stars fallen to earth. The streets are narrow, cobbled, and uneven, lined with timber-framed houses that lean forward as if whispering secrets to one another. In the distance, a cathedral towers its silhouette sharp against a navy sky, a beacon for pilgrims and townsfolk alike. Bells chime from its spire, marking the evening hours, just as they have for centuries, calling bakers to finish their loaves and shopkeepers to bolt their shutters. Beneath those bells, life hums steady, chaotic, and deeply human. Step closer, and you'll hear the murmur of conversation drifting from an inn's doorway, mingled with the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke. A blacksmith hammers his final horseshoe of the day, sparks cascading like tiny fireflies into the dimness of his forge. A woman carrying a clay jug hurries home, her shadow swaying against a plaster wall. A cluster of children giggles in an alley, chasing a stray dog through puddles left by an afternoon rainstorm. The streets are alive but intimate, the closeness of the buildings and the warmth of lantern light creating a sense of safety, even in the growing dark. Medieval cities were bustling hubs of commerce, politics, and faith. To a traveler arriving from a quiet village, the sights would be overwhelming rows of merchant stalls, crammed with goods from across Europe, coins clinking in hands, calloused from farm work, and voices carrying accents from lands far away. There were governing councils and mayors, a tangle of laws and customs, and towering defensive walls, punctuated with gates and watchtowers. The city was not just a place to live. It was a fortress of opportunity, wealth, and culture. Yet for all its vibrancy, there was an edge of danger. Fires could rip through timber homes in hours. Disease stalked the streets, and crime was a shadow lurking behind every corner. The smell of the city was a story in itself. Imagine warm bread from the bakery mingling with the iron tang of a blacksmith's forge, the incense from a church altar wafting through the open door, and the less pleasant odor of livestock refuse. And humanity crowded together. Pigs roamed alleyways, hens clucked in courtyards, and horses clattered over cobblestones, pulling carts heavy with trade goods. This was the lifeblood of medieval commerce markets, that stretched for blocks selling spices from the East woolen cloth from England and fine wines from France. In the quiet hours, the city transformed. Watchmen patrolled with staffs, lanterns swinging gently in their hands. Dogs barked at distant sounds, and somewhere a lute plucked softly through the open shutters of a tavern. If you stood on a bridge overlooking the river, you'd see reflections of the moon dancing between the silhouettes of water wheels and moored barges. This was a city that never truly slept, a living tapestry woven from voices, bells, and footsteps, its heartbeat as steady as the cathedral bells. Picture the countryside of medieval Europe, a vast quilt of green fields, forests and villages stitched together by dirt tracks and winding rivers. For most of the early Middle Ages, around 90% of Europeans lived in these rural landscapes, working on land owned by lords, monasteries, or the crown. Life here moved with the seasons: spring planting, summer toil, autumn harvest, and long winters spent in smoky, dimly lit cottages. For many peasants, this was the only world they knew. But by the 11th century, something was changing. Trade routes that had lain dormant after the fall of the Roman Empire began to stir with life again. Merchants carried goods from distant lands, spices from the east, silk from Byzantium, and salt for preserving food. Coastal ports bustled with ships, and river towns became vital hubs. Gradually, these trickles of commerce became streams, then rivers of opportunity, and people began to move. Villages that once clung to the shadow of castles or monasteries expanded into towns, and those towns, over decades, grew into cities. Imagine a young farmer standing in a field, calloused hands wrapped around a hoe, hearing tales of bustling marketplaces where coins jingled and goods changed hands faster than a scythe through grain. Stories of freedom whispered along roads traveled by peddlers and pilgrims in the city. No lord could claim your every breath, and wealth could be built not from soil, but from skill. For some, these tales were irresistible. Slowly, families packed their belongings, left behind thatched cottages, and followed cart tracks to the distant glow of city lanterns. Monasteries played their part too. In the quiet stone halls of abbeys, monks preserved ancient knowledge, creating manuscripts and teaching literacy. Students flocked to these religious centers, and nearby towns grew to accommodate them. A scholar's presence meant a market for parchment ink and food. Artisans followed, and the ripple of growth spread it outward. The High Middle Ages, from roughly 1000 to 1300, saw Europe's population swell. With better agricultural tools like the heavy plow and improved crop rotation, food supplies increased. This abundance encouraged trade, which in turn encouraged migration. Cities became magnets for ambition. A blacksmith's son might become a skilled craftsman with his own workshop. A merchant's apprentice could one day trade in foreign ports. Yet this migration was not without risk. Leaving a rural home often meant stepping away from protection and predictability. In villages, life was tough but steady. In cities, fortunes could rise and fall with a single deal or illness. The streets teemed with strangers, and survival required cleverness and grit. Still, the promise of freedom and opportunity outweighed fear for many. If you picture the roads of medieval Europe during this time, they would be alive with movement. Peasants with bundles on their backs, traders leading laden mules, monks traveling between abbeys, and pilgrims making their way to holy shrines. Bridges and toll stations buzzed with activity, and at every turn, travelers swapped news songs and gossip. This steady flow of people created a new social fabric. Cities became melting pots where accents mingled, traditions blended, and innovations spread. Alongside merchants and artisans came ideas, architecture, fashion, literature, all weaving a rich tapestry of medieval culture. The rural exodus was not a sudden flood, but a slow tide that transformed Europe over centuries, bringing its greatest cathedrals, universities, and markets into being. As dusk settles over one of these growing towns, imagine lanterns flickering along a busy thoroughfare where ox carts creak and dogs bark. A farmer's daughter peers in awe at a shop window filled with dyed cloth, something she'd never seen at home. The scent of roasting meat wafts from a nearby inn, mingling with smoke from dozens of hearths. Her future, once bound to her father's field, now seems as white as the city gates she passed through that morning. This was the draw of medieval cities, a beacon of possibility against the dark backdrop of feudal life. The countryside of medieval Europe was a world of rhythm and repetition, fields tilled with wooden plows, herds grazing under watchful shepherds, and cottages huddled near streams for water. Most peasants never traveled farther than a few miles from home, yet whispers of bustling towns reached even these remote places. A traveling peddler might arrive with brightly dyed ribbons or spices that smelled of far-off lands, his tales filling the smoky cottage with visions of crowded streets and glittering coins. Villages slowly transformed as trade routes strengthened. Some grew at crossroads or near monasteries that offered refuge and education. And from these humble beginnings, towns rose like seedlings in fertile soil. Picture a pilgrim pausing at a monastery gate, exchanging stories with monks, his presence adding new colors to the tapestry of rural life. Over decades, these resting places for travelers became thriving markets, their stalls spilling over with wool, leather, honey, and salt. For a peasant choosing to leave home, the journey was daunting. Dirt roads wound through dense forests where wolves prowled in winter. River crossings required ferrymen's skill, and nights meant sleeping under hedgerows or in barns trading a coin for straw bedding. Yet hope burned brightly in those who dared to go with the dream of wages instead of dues, freedom instead of fealty. Each step toward the city was a step toward reinvention, and every milestone, a market town, a toll gate, a roadside inn, felt like crossing an invisible threshold between worlds. By the 13th century, these migration patterns reshaped Europe. Cities swelled, their walls extended, and their populations grew more diverse. Imagine the scene at a city gate: farmers with baskets of eggs, traders with bolts of cloth, pilgrims in dusty cloaks, and a runaway serf keeping his hood low, hoping not to be recognized. This blend of ambition, fear, and opportunity created an energy unique to the medieval city, a magnet that pulled people from the quiet rhythms of the countryside into the heartbeat of urban life. Picture a peasant boy standing at the edge of a bustling medieval city gate, his heart pounding like a drum. Behind him lies a lifetime of toil on a lord's land. Dawns spent plowing fields, winters huddled in smoky huts, and evenings under the watchful eye of a steward who holds power over every breath he takes. Ahead of him is something almost mythical: freedom. In medieval Europe, a rule known as a year and a day offered a rare escape from bondage. If a serf could live within a city's walls, unclaimed by his lord, for that length of time, he would become a freeman. The law was both a beacon and a gamble. Many peasants slipped away at night, leaving behind families, debts, and obligations traveling narrow paths, lit only by moonlight. Arriving in a city was not a triumph, but the start of a perilous countdown. To declare oneself openly was dangerous. A determined lord could send men to retrieve a runaway and drag them back to servitude. So the newly arrived peasant would melt into the city's rhythm seeking work, in workshops, taverns, or as a laborer at the docks, living quietly until that magic year passed. City officials often turned a blind eye. Urban growth depended on labor, and every new set of hands helped build walls, unload carts, and keep markets bustling. It was a quiet, unspoken bargain. The city gave refuge, and the runaway helped fuel its economy. Some stewards and bailiffs, tasked with hunting escapees, were even rumored to accept bribes looking the other way. As rural workers slipped into city life, life for these fugitives was rarely easy. Housing was cramped and expensive, and wages meager. Many took shelter in overfilled inns, or in the lofts of workshops, sleeping beside sacks of grain or bolts of wool. They worked long days, often performing tasks no city-born worker wanted, hauling refuse, carting goods through crowded alleys, or sweeping streets before dawn. Yet every day was a small victory, a step closer to autonomy. Picture a runaway kneeling beside a forge, sparks flickering across his face as he learns the trade of a blacksmith, or scrubbing tables in a tavern, earning a few coins each night. Each morning the city bell rings, and the countdown continues, day 1, 2, day 3, until finally, day 366 arrives. With that sunrise, a once-bound peasant becomes a freeman, able to marry without permission, own property, and choose his destiny. Freedom, however, was not just a legal status, it was a cultural transformation. The medieval city was a place of reinvention. Here, a runaway serf might join a guild apprentice in a craft, or even one day open a shop. The transition from serfdom to citizenship was a slow unraveling of feudal ties, and every new freeman strengthened the city's independence from the countryside's rigid hierarchies. These quiet acts of escape and survival reshaped Europe. Cities swelled with former serfs, each carrying rural skills that became invaluable in trade and industry. Markets flourished, guilds gained power, and a new urban class began to emerge. Freedom spread, not through war or rebellion, but through thousands of silent choices made by individuals slipping away from manor lands under cover of darkness. At night, when the city gates closed, you can imagine some of these runaways lying awake in rented lofts, listening to the clatter of hooves outside, the cries of merchants packing their stalls, and the deep tolling of bells from the cathedral tower. They clutched their new life tightly, knowing one knock at the door could still send them back to fields they'd vowed never to see again. But with each passing day, the danger faded and hope grew. In medieval cities, freedom was measured not in gold, but in days survived a quiet, steady march toward a future of their own making. Freedom for a medieval serf was almost unimaginable. Born, tied to the land, his days were marked by obligation, sunrise labor in his lord's fields, evenings tending his own small plot, and winters spent repairing tools by dim firelight. Yet the law of a year and a day offered a glimmer of hope. If he could slip past the manor gates and live undetected in a city for that length of time, he would become a freeman. Picture him on his first night in the city, sleeping in a hayloft above a carpenter's shop, the scent of pine shavings sharp in the cool air. Every creak of a floorboard sends his heart racing. Terrified his lord's steward might appear, days turn into weeks as he works odd jobs hauling water, sweeping taverns, delivering firewood. He counts the days like prayers, each one bringing him closer to freedom. The city becomes both a sanctuary and a crucible. It teaches him to navigate crowded alleys, barter for bread, and dodge suspicious glances. He learns to listen more than he speaks, to blend into the bustling rhythm of life. At festivals, when masks and revelry fill the streets, he allows himself a rare smile, knowing his disguise is safest among a sea of strangers. When the final day arrives, a full year, and a day since his arrival, he steps into the morning light, head held high. The city bells toll not for him, but their sound feels like a celebration. Now he can marry without permission, own property, and take an apprenticeship. For one man, this law changed everything. For Europe, it helped transform cities into sanctuaries of opportunity, places where destiny wasn't dictated by birth, but by courage. Close your eyes and picture a medieval city, narrow streets, winding between timber-framed buildings, lanterns swinging over market squares and bells tolling from a towering cathedral. It feels busy and noisy, but compared to our sprawling modern metropolises, these cities were surprisingly small, where today's London stretches endlessly, swallowing millions of lives. Medieval London, around 1300, held just 80,000 to 100,000 residents. York and Bristol, considered major cities, were home to only 10,000 to 12,000 souls. Across Europe, there were only about 15 to 20 cities with populations near 25,000. Even great centers like Cologne or Nuremberg in Germany and Valencia or Barcelona in Spain seemed intimate by today's standards. To a peasant stepping through a city gate for the first time, however, this was overwhelming. Streets hummed with foreign accents. Markets overflowed with goods, and buildings rose higher than any barn or farmhouse. The sheer density of people, animals, and trades created a sense of excitement and danger. Many of these cities grew from ancient Roman settlements or market villages, their layouts organic rather than planned. Streets curved unpredictably, narrow alleys formed labyrinths, and central plazas bustled under towering churches or castles. Surrounding walls dotted with watchtowers defined the city's edges. Beyond them stretched farmland, forests, and villages, making the city feel like a world apart. At night, when the gates were locked, the city became its own universe, sealed off from the dangers of the countryside. Though small by population, medieval cities loomed large in influence. London was called the mirror and exemplar of the realm by King Edward III. Bruges and Ghent thrived as textile capitals, drawing merchants from across Europe. Venice, Genoa, and Florence grew wealthy through maritime trade. These hubs became power centers, shaping politics, art, and commerce far beyond their modest size. To imagine their scale, picture yourself standing at the heart of medieval Paris. Around 1300, the city's 200,000 inhabitants made it one of the largest in Europe, yet it would feel cozy to a modern traveler used to bustling capitals. With millions of residents, streets were narrow homes, leaned over each other, and communities were tightly knit. The city's skyline was dominated by church spires, rather than skyscrapers, and the river Seine, or Thames, served as the primary highway for trade and transport. This intimacy created a sense of connection. Residents recognized faces, shopkeepers knew their customers, and news traveled quickly through gossip and town criers. At the same time, a city this size could feel crowded, even suffocating. Timber houses pressed close together, livestock shared streets with merchants, and waste piled in alleys. To a villager used to open fields, it was a shocking sight. The thrill of opportunity mingled with the stench of too many people living side by side. Markets were the lifeblood of these compact cities. Farmers and traders from surrounding villages streamed in daily, their carts creaking under loads of wool, cheese, and vegetables. Merchants displayed silks, spices, and precious metals brought by caravans and ships. Each city developed a specialty: Florence with fine cloth, Lubeck with salt and fish, Bruges with tapestries. Even small cities served as crucial nodes in Europe's growing trade network, proving that influence wasn't measured by size alone. Walking these streets at dusk, you'd feel the pulse of the city in every step. Apprentices calling to one another as they haul goods, children darting between carts, monks filing silently to evening prayers. Lanterns cast long shadows, and somewhere a minstrel plucks a lute. The city may only hold tens of thousands, but it feels immense, a crossroads of culture and commerce, where ambition and danger intertwine. In a way, these cities were like pressure cookers. Their small size intensified every sensation, every smell, every sound. The closeness of neighbors created both community and conflict, and within these walls, the seeds of modern urban life were sown. Medieval cities might not rival our modern skylines, but in spirit, they were every bit as alive and electric. Medieval cities were small by modern standards, yet to their inhabitants, they felt colossal. Standing atop the city walls, you'd see a sea of rooftops, steeply pitched and thatched chimneys, puffing smoke into the sky. Beyond lay fields and forests, their tranquility starkly contrasting the bustle within. A traveler entering London in 1300 might have been awed by its 80,000 residents, a number that made it one of the largest cities in Europe. By comparison, York's 12,000 seemed intimate, but no less vibrant. The compactness intensified every aspect of life. Narrow streets forced neighbors to know one another. A quarrel over a bucket of water or a misplaced cart might escalate quickly, yet these same tight spaces fostered community. When festivals arrived, banners stretched across streets like colorful ceilings, and laughter echoed off timber-framed walls. Cities developed around geography. Rivers shaped their trade routes, hills offered natural defenses, and ancient Roman roads provided foundations for expansion. The city's skyline told its story: church spires piercing the heavens, fortified towers guarding gates, and bustling bridges lined with shops. Even as darkness fell, lanterns lit markets, and taverns glowed like hearths scattered throughout a labyrinth of alleys. For medieval dwellers, their city was the center of the world. Travelers brought news of foreign lands, but most citizens lived their entire lives within sight of their cathedral's spire. And yet, within those cramped walls, commerce and culture flourished, proving that influence isn't measured by size, but by the vibrancy of life within. As the sun rises over a medieval port city, the masts of ships stand like a forest of slender trees against the sky, sails fluttering gently in the breeze. Longshoremen haul crates of wool, barrels of wine, and sacks of grain from creaking vessels, while merchants tally goods with quick strokes of a quill. The medieval city was not just a local marketplace, it was a hub of international trade, a gateway between distant lands and bustling towns. Take London as an example. Around the year 1100, London had a population of about 40,000, comparable to Bruges and Ghent across the English Channel. This was no coincidence. England's countryside produced vast quantities of raw wool, which was transported to London and loaded onto ships bound for Bruges and Ghent, both famous for their textile industries. Their skilled weavers transformed raw wool into fine cloth, which merchants then sold across Europe. Some of this cloth made its way back to London, now far more valuable than when it left English shores. This triangular network of production and trade created prosperity for all three cities, weaving them together into a tapestry of commerce. Bruges became a magnet for merchants from Italy, Germany, and beyond. Venetian traders brought glassware, silks, and spices, while Hanseatic merchants arrived with amber timber and salted fish from the Baltic. The streets of Bruges bustled with accents from across Europe, and its canals glistened with activity as ships from every corner of the continent moored at its docks. Trade routes radiated like spokes from these cities. The Mediterranean connected Italy's maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, to the Levant, where spices, textiles, and precious stones flowed westward. From the Baltic, the Hanseatic League dominated shipping lanes, linking cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Riga in a powerful commercial alliance. Overland routes carried caravans of furs, wool, and grain across Europe's heartlands, while rivers such as the Rhine and Danube served as natural highways bustling with barges. Markets were vibrant crossroads of cultures. Imagine walking through a fair in Champagne, France, a series of massive trading events held annually in the 12th and 13th centuries. Merchants erected colorful tents, and the smell of exotic spices filled the air. Cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, and saffron from the Middle East. Jewelers displayed fine silver from German mines, while clothiers from Flanders showcased richly dyed fabrics. These fairs became engines of economic growth, drawing bankers, artisans, and traders from across Europe. This explosion of trade didn't just move goods, it moved ideas. Through merchants, Europe absorbed Arabic numerals, medical knowledge, and scientific concepts from the Islamic world. Italian city-states, like Florence and Venice, pioneered banking practices, creating letters of credit and bills of exchange that allowed wealth to flow more easily than ever before. A Florentine banker's ledger might record debts owed by merchants in Bruges, loans to wool producers in England, and investments in a ship sailing for Constantinople, all managed without a single coin physically changing hands. For ordinary townsfolk, these networks brought a taste of the world beyond their city walls. Shops stocked glass beads from Venice ceramics, from Spain, and sugar from Cyprus. Even in a modest English town, a loaf of bread might be sweetened with imported spices, and a noblewoman's gown could be trimmed with silks that had crossed deserts and seas. Trade turned medieval cities into glittering marketplaces of wealth and wonder. Of course, this prosperity came at a cost. Pirates prowled sea lanes, bandits lurked along roads, and toll collectors grew rich, taxing goods as they moved through different territories. Merchants often hired guards to protect caravans, and city walls became symbols not just of defense, but of economic strength. A fortified port city was a safe harbor in a dangerous world, and its wealth was visible in every soaring cathedral and bustling dock. The hum of trade was relentless, hammering in the shipyards, creaking of wagons entering city gates, shouts of dock workers unloading goods. Even at night, lanterns glimmered in counting houses, where merchants and bankers calculated profits. These medieval trade networks turned small walled cities into powerful players on the European stage, connecting farmers and craftsmen to markets they would never see, and laying the groundwork for the globalized world we know today. The heartbeat of every medieval city was trade. Imagine walking along the docks of Bruges at dawn, the masts of ships swaying like forest canopies, and the salty tang of the sea mingling with the scent of tar and spices. Longshoremen haul crates filled with wool, their rough hands blackened from rope and labor, while merchants haggle in a dozen languages. Trade fairs transformed cities into melting pots of culture. In Champagne, merchants erected tents like a canvas village illuminated by lanterns as night fell. Spices from the east sat alongside Flemish tapestries. Italian glassware glimmered next to Baltic furs. Children stared wide-eyed at exotic parrots brought by sailors and musicians, roamed between stalls, their melodies while softening the relentless sound of commerce. Commerce shaped everything: architecture, politics, even security. City walls weren't just for defense. They were symbols of wealth protecting not only lives, but goods worth fortunes. Inside counting houses, bankers scribbled figures by the candlelight, their ledgers mapping the pulse of a continent's economy. The rise of trade networks made medieval Europe surprisingly interconnected. A craftsman in London might fashion buckles for a Florentine merchant, while Venetian bankers financed ventures that brought English wool to Bruges. Goods traveled thousands of miles, yet so did ideas. New mathematical concepts, agricultural techniques, and even recipes found their way along the same roads as caravans. The medieval city was not a static world. It pulsed with movement, curiosity, and ambition. Step into a medieval city on a warm summer afternoon, and the first thing you'll notice is not the noise of clattering hooves or the chatter of merchants. It's the smell. Timber-framed houses lean over narrow cobblestone streets, their upper stories casting deep shadows. But even the shade can't mask the stench. Wastewater trickles down open drains carved into the center of the streets. Livestock roams freely, leaving behind reminders of their presence. And every breeze carries a pungent mix of smoke, sweat, and refuse. In this era, scientific understanding of disease and sanitation was centuries away. Bacteria were unknown, but medieval people weren't oblivious. They knew filth was unpleasant, and over time, they noticed that sickness often followed filth. Wealthier families tried to maintain cleaner homes, spreading herbs on floors to mask odors, and cities gradually began to enforce rules about waste disposal. In London, by 1371, it was no longer legal to throw household waste or chamber pots out of windows directly onto the streets, a common practice that had plagued city dwellers for generations. Instead, residents were expected to carry waste downstairs and dump it into central drainage channels that ran along many roads. Violators faced fines, and city records show a growing obsession with cleanliness as fears of disease escalated after the devastation of the Black Death in the mid-14th century. In York and Coventry, citizens were held responsible for the patch of street in front of their homes, and failing to sweep or scrub it could cost them hefty penalties. Coventry even fined homeowners 12 pence for skipping their Saturday cleaning, a significant sum that ensured brooms were busy come the weekend. Still, cleanliness was a constant struggle. Visitors and travelers brought their animals into the city, and their droppings littered the streets. Butchers slaughtered animals in open-air markets, their waste flowing into gutters, and fishmongers dumped heads and scales behind stalls. In tightly packed neighborhoods, cesspits, deep pits, used to collect human waste, often overflowed or leaked into nearby wells, contaminating drinking water. The air was heavy with smoke from hearth fires and blacksmith forges, and residents' clothes absorbed the scent of wood dung and grease. Yet medieval citizens adapted. Street sweepers known as rakers worked daily to scrape manure and refuse from major thoroughfares, piling it onto carts. Some of this waste was ferried outside the city walls, where farmers used it as fertilizer. In certain cities, refuse collectors were so vital that their positions were funded by taxes and fines, creating an early version of municipal waste management. Even homes reflected these sanitation challenges. Poorer residents lived in one-room dwellings with packed earth floors, often shared with livestock for warmth. These floors were layered with rushes or straw, which trapped dirt crumbs and insects. Periodically, households would remove the soiled rushes and replace them, though some households neglected this chore for months, creating breeding grounds for fleas. Wealthier families had wooden or tile floors and built rudimentary privies that emptied into cesspits or waterways. Bathing was a complicated matter. Bathhouses were common in many medieval cities, especially in places influenced by Roman traditions, but they came with a reputation for sinfulness, and outbreaks of plague sometimes caused authorities to close them. Many people bathed only occasionally, relying instead on linen undergarments to absorb sweat and dirt, which were washed more frequently. Herbal washes, perfumes, and scented oils masked odors, creating a culture of cleanliness centered more on appearance than sterilization. Despite these struggles, cities weren't resigned to filth. Their evolving cleanliness laws show a growing awareness of the link between sanitation and health. After waves of plague, authorities became stricter and communities grew more diligent. Waste carts rattling through narrow lanes, fines for dumping refuse, and organized Saturday cleanings all show an effort to tame the chaos of city living. Close your eyes and imagine standing on a medieval bridge, the scent of tanneries and fish stalls heavy in the air. A woman leans from a window, shaking a rug, while a boy sweeps a doorway. Below, a drainage channel glints in the sunlight, carrying water and everything else out of the city. It's noisy, dirty, and alive, a vivid reminder that even centuries ago, humanity was already trying to balance urban growth with basic sanitation. Medieval sanitation might seem primitive, but to the people of the time, their efforts represented progress. Picture a street early in the morning, shopkeepers tossing buckets of water to wash away refuse, apprentices sweeping with worn brooms, and the sharp scent of vinegar used to scrub market stalls. Regulations banning waste dumping from windows, while often ignored, showed that city authorities recognized the importance of hygiene. Rivers were lifelines, yet they also became dumping grounds. Tanneries poured chemicals downstream, Fishmongers left heaps of offal, and cesspits overflowed during heavy rains. But medieval people weren't indifferent. They built public fountains to supply fresh water, often adorned with carvings and statues. Even in poorer neighborhoods, wells were community gathering points where gossip and daily chores intertwined. Inside homes, rushes were replaced periodically, sprinkled with lavender or rosemary to mask odors. Wealthier citizens used perfumed oils, and barbers doubled as rudimentary doctors offering herbal washes. Bathhouses, though controversial, were a testament to urban sophistication where scented baths and massages offered an escape from crowded streets. While the streets carried an unmistakable odor, they were also alive with activity. Children played beside vendors selling pies. Women bartered for bread, and bells from the cathedral cut through the din. Filth was part of life, but so was resilience, and the medieval city's very survival amid such density was proof of remarkable adaptability. Imagine a crisp morning in 14th century London. The city is just waking up. Merchants are lifting the shutters of their shops. Bakers pull steaming loaves from their ovens. And somewhere down a narrow alley, the rhythmic clop of hooves announces the arrival of the city's newest innovation, garbage carts. These wooden carts, drawn by sturdy horses, were part of one of medieval Europe's earliest organized waste management systems, a response to the mounting chaos of life within crowded walls. In 1372, London authorities formally introduced a publicly funded refuse collection service, financed by fines levied on unscrupulous brewers who had been caught cutting corners. With this unexpected revenue, the city purchased 24 horses and 12 carts dedicated to hauling away the debris of urban life. These carts trundled through busy streets once a week, collecting refuse from designated spots where residents were instructed to pile their trash. For medieval Londoners, this was revolutionary. No longer was garbage simply dumped into alleys or rivers without thought. Other cities quickly followed. Norwich and York established their own systems, while Coventry synchronized its collection days with the Saturday cleaning rule, turning the weekend into a semi-ritual of urban order. By the early 16th century, London's carts came 3 times a week, showing just how quickly demand outpaced early infrastructure. Waste disposal became a sign of civic pride. A city with organized rubbish collection projected wealth efficiency and a sense of control in an era often dominated by unpredictability. Still, waste management in a medieval city was far from perfect. Visitors, pilgrims, and traders arrived daily, bringing livestock carts and a fresh avalanche of refuse. Carts could not keep up with the sheer volume. Between collections, rakers and scavengers worked tirelessly, scraping manure and garbage from thoroughfares, piling it onto carts, and ferrying it outside the city walls. There the waste was either burned, buried, or sold as fertilizer to nearby farmers, demonstrating a surprisingly early understanding of recycling. Infrastructure expanded alongside these services. Bridges connected bustling trade hubs, aqueducts and wells, supplied fresh water, and cobblestone paving began to replace muddy tracks in wealthier districts. Cities invested heavily in public works, often funded by merchant taxes or church donations. The same cathedrals that towered over medieval skylines often contributed financially to roads, fountains, and bridges, cementing their role as civic as well as spiritual centers. But medieval engineering had its limits. Drainage systems were primitive, with open channels running along street centers, often clogging with debris. Heavy rains could turn alleys into foul rivers. Even so, these channels represented progress cities were attempting to manage water flow and waste at a time when most rural villages had no such systems. Wealthier households built private latrines connected to cesspits, while public latrines served poorer residents. These facilities were often perched above rivers or streams, a solution that, while convenient, contaminated water sources downstream. The creation of organized cleaning crews introduced new jobs. Rakers became a familiar sight, scraping up dung and dirt, while gong farmers cleaned out cesspits under the cover of darkness, often working knee-deep in foul sludge. Their work was unpleasant, but it was essential to city life. For many poor laborers, it provided steady pay, and some even earned enough to live modestly within city walls, a reminder that infrastructure shaped not only health, but social mobility. At dawn, imagine the soundscape of this emerging system: the squeal of wooden wheels on cobblestone, the crack of a whip as a driver urges his horses forward, and the calls of rakers warning pedestrians to make way. In the glow of lanterns, teams of workers scrape, sweep, and haul, performing a kind of nocturnal ballet that keeps the city habitable. These early systems weren't glamorous, but they reveal a medieval determination to impose order on chaos. In a world of plagues, fires, and unpredictable harvests, clean streets and functioning bridges were symbols of hope, proof that even in the Middle Ages, people were thinking about public health, safety, and quality of life. The garbage carts of London in the 1370s were a marvel of early municipal planning. Imagine the spectacle: a line of horses clopping down Cheapside, their carts piled high with refuse drivers shouting for pedestrians to clear the way. Children peered out of windows as men with rakes scraped muck from the gutters into heaps, working quickly to avoid blocking merchants setting up stalls. Public works extended beyond waste collection. Cobblestone streets replaced muddy paths in wealthier areas, while wooden bridges evolved into grand stone structures lined with shops buzzing like miniature markets. Water conduits carried spring water from miles away, pouring into sculpted basins, where housewives filled buckets, their chatter blending with birdsong. Jobs tied to these systems were harsh but steady. Gong farmers worked at night, waist-deep in cesspits, scraping filth into barrels for removal. Their efforts, though unseen, kept cities habitable. A poor man hauling waste by lantern light might not dream of wealth, but his work gave him a foothold in the urban world. Early infrastructure wasn't perfect, but it revealed a society that valued order, even amid plague outbreaks and political unrest. Cities invested in clean streets, sturdy walls, and public fountains. These systems, primitive as they were, laid the groundwork for the modern concept of civic responsibility. As dusk falls over a medieval city, lanterns flicker to life along narrow alleys, and the clang of a distant bell announces curfew. Gates creak closed, sealing the city from the outside world, and guards settle into their posts. Yet within these walls, danger still lurks. For all its bustle and opportunity, the medieval city was a place of tension where theft, assault, and even murder were constant threats. By the late 14th century, crime rates in cities like London were rising sharply, partly due to swelling populations. Crowded streets created easy opportunities for pickpockets and cut purses, and markets brimmed with valuables that tempted desperate hands. Wealthy merchants employed private guards, while poorer residents relied on watchmen and the goodwill of neighbors. But security systems were rudimentary. and fear was a constant undercurrent of city life. Curfews were a primary defense. Each evening, a bell rang from a cathedral tower echoing across rooftops and narrow streets signaling citizens to return home. City gates were locked for the night, cutting off travel and trapping residents inside the walls until morning. Streets grew quiet, except for the heavy tread of watchmen patrolling with staffs and lanterns. Those caught wandering without cause risked arrest or worse suspicion of criminal intent. Yet danger often came not from strangers, but from disputes between neighbors. Medieval court records tell vivid stories. A goldsmith's son urinated into a pot and emptied it onto a passerby's shoes, sparking a fight that ended in tragedy. An eel seller in London was beaten to death for dumping eel skins in front of a shop, and quarrels over waste disposal frequently escalated into violence. These tales paint a vivid picture of life in cramped, tense communities where even small insults could ignite deadly confrontations. Street fights weren't the only hazards. Dark alleys and crowded taverns offered perfect cover for criminals. Gangs sometimes prowled after curfew, preying on travelers who had failed to reach the safety of an inn before the gates closed. Many cities responded with harsh punishments. Thieves could lose a hand, while murderers faced public execution, often in market squares to serve as warnings. Law enforcement was a patchwork system. Cities employed constables and watchmen, but policing largely depended on community participation. Hue and cry laws required citizens to raise an alarm and pursue criminals when a crime was witnessed. Failure to respond could lead to fines, meaning neighbors were both your protectors and potential judges. This communal vigilance created a tight-knit, if sometimes oppressive atmosphere, where every misstep was noticed. To further maintain order, many cities instituted neighborhood watches, dividing districts into wards led by aldermen. These local leaders organized patrols and kept track of residents, turning urban security into a blend of official oversight and community enforcement. Despite these measures, crime was difficult to control. Overcrowding and poverty pushed some residents to desperation, while wealthy merchants and nobles often bribed officials to escape justice, deepening class divides. The fear of violence was woven into daily routines. Travelers carried letters of protection or hired guards to escort them through city gates. Shopkeepers barred windows with iron grills, and wealthy homes installed heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron studs. Even churches became sanctuaries for fugitives seeking temporary protection from arrest, adding another layer of complexity to medieval justice. Close your eyes and picture a medieval city at midnight. Lanterns sway in the breeze, throwing pools of golden light onto damp cobblestones. The distant howl of a stray dog carries through the streets, mingling with the creak of armor as a watchman passes. Somewhere in the dark, a fight breaks out over spilled ale or unpaid debt, and a bell tolls softly, echoing off stone walls. This was the reality of medieval urban life, a place of opportunity and progress, but also of constant vigilance, where safety was never guaranteed, and trust was a fragile currency. Fear of crime shaped the medieval city's rhythm. After curfew, streets emptied quickly, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the crackle of torches and the murmur of watchmen's voices. A traveler caught outside without a good reason risked being questioned, or worse, mistaken for a thief. Public punishment was both justice and spectacle. The stocks in the market square drew crowds, children pointing and laughing at petty criminals. For serious crimes, gallows loomed outside the city walls, a grim warning to all who passed through the gates. Yet churches offered sanctuary, and fugitives could clutch the door ring of a cathedral, gaining temporary protection. Neighborhood disputes filled court records, painting vivid portraits of medieval life. Fights over drainage ditches, boundary walls, or a tipped-over bucket could escalate quickly. But these quarrels also showed how closely neighbors' lives intertwined. In a world of close quarters, cooperation was essential, even if tempers often flared. The city's darkness was real, but so was its vigilance. Watchmen bells and curfews gave residents a sense of security, and guilds often provided private guards for their members. This mixture of communal effort and local pride created a balance, making the medieval city a place where danger and safety danced on a knife's edge. At first glance, a medieval city might seem chaotic, a jumble of crooked streets, noisy markets, and crowded homes. But beneath that surface was a rigid social order. Every person, from the wealthiest merchant to the humblest laborer, had a place in this hierarchy, and the lines between these groups were often as solid as the city walls themselves. At the top stood the landlords, nobles, and city officials. Some were members of powerful families who owned property and controlled trade rights. Others were mayors or aldermen elected by influential guilds, overseeing taxation, markets, and city defense. These elites lived in stone houses with glass windows, a luxury at the time, and their wealth was often displayed through tapestries, silverware, and elaborate clothing dyed in costly colors like crimson or deep blue. Just below them were merchants, the lifeblood of the city's economy. Successful traders had wealth rivaling minor nobility, dealing in wool spices, salt, or wine. Many built multi-story houses, their shops on the ground floor and family quarters above. They also financed infrastructure funding, bridges, chapels, and even schools, leaving legacies that would shape their cities for centuries. Next came artisans and craftsmen, the backbone of medieval urban life. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons. Bakers filled streets with the scent of fresh bread. Tailors stitched fine garments. Each craft had its own guild, a powerful organization that regulated quality, set prices, and protected its members. Becoming a guildmaster was a lifelong goal, but the journey was long. Boys often began as apprentices at age 10 or 12, living with their masters and working long hours for little pay. After years of training, they became journeymen, traveling from city to hone their craft before finally presenting a masterpiece to earn the coveted title of master. Guilds were more than trade unions. They were pillars of medieval community life. They provided sick pay, burial funds, and support for widows and orphans. Guild halls were often grand buildings that served as both meeting spaces and symbols of power, their banners and crests proudly displayed during parades and religious festivals. Some guilds even sponsored churches or chapels, commissioning stained glass windows depicting their patron saints or tools of their trade. Below the guild craftsmen were unskilled laborers and servants. These men and women carried goods through busy markets, unloaded ships, and cleaned streets. Many lived in cramped quarters, often renting single rooms or sharing lofts above workshops. Their work was backbreaking, but without them, cities could not function. Street sweepers, dock workers, and porters were essential to the rhythm of urban life, even if they rarely enjoyed its rewards. Women's roles in this structure were complex. Noble women managed estates and finances in their husband's absence, while merchant wives often handled shopkeeping and trade negotiations. Widows could inherit businesses, and some became respected guild members in their own right. Yet for many women, work meant domestic service brewing ale, spinning wool, or washing clothes along the riverbanks. Their labor was vital, though often undervalued. Religion permeated every tier of society. Parish churches anchored neighborhoods, and monasteries provided charity education and medical care. Even guilds had spiritual duties, organizing processions and sponsoring masses for deceased members. This blend of economic and religious life reinforced social bonds, ensuring that the city's hierarchy felt both practical and divinely ordained. Walking through a medieval street, you would see this order reflected in the architecture. Wealthy merchants' homes towered over rows of modest wooden houses, shop signs often painted or carved to represent a craft, an iron horseshoe for a farrier, a loaf of bread for a baker marked professions. Apprentices hustled through alleys carrying supplies, while guild members in fine cloaks strode proudly to meetings. Despite the noise and chaos, there was an underlying structure, a living hierarchy that gave shape to the medieval city's heartbeat. Close your eyes and imagine bells ringing for Vespers merchants locking away their wares, and craftsmen gathering in the glow of a guild hall's lanterns. These organizations, along with the strict social order, gave medieval cities their rhythm, an intricate balance of ambition, tradition, and community that laid the groundwork for the modern professions we know today. Guilds were the lifeblood of a city's identity. Step into a grand guild hall. Banners hang from carved beams, and a long oak table stretches beneath stained glass windows. Masters in fine robes debate trade regulations by candlelight, their words shaping prices, quality standards, and apprenticeships for the entire city. These guilds were as much families as professional networks. They funded churches, cared for orphans, and threw lavish feasts where apprentices earned a rare taste of roasted swan or spiced wine. On feast days, guild members paraded through streets in matching colors, their tools displayed as emblems of pride. Social mobility was possible through these networks. An ambitious apprentice could rise to journeyman, then master, and eventually own property. For many, guild membership meant security insurance against illness, fair wages, and a voice in city politics. In a world often dominated by nobility, guilds gave commoners power, proving that skill and unity could rival birthright. Beyond guild halls, this hierarchy shaped neighborhoods. Butchers clustered near rivers for easy disposal of waste. Goldsmiths occupied central squares, their shops glowing with lamplight reflecting off polished metal. Walking through the city was like reading a map of its economy, each street corner, a chapter of a larger story. As twilight settles over a medieval city, the silhouette of a cathedral dominates the skyline, its spire reaching toward heaven. These towering structures weren't just places of worship, they were monuments of ambition, engineering, and artistry that took centuries to complete. York Minster, begun in 627 and finished in 1472, stood as a testament to generations of masons and glaziers, while Cologne Cathedral's construction stretched over 300 years, an ever-growing symbol of faith and wealth. To a medieval traveler, such buildings would have felt almost supernatural, glowing with candlelight and painted glass, their bells calling citizens to prayer and marking the rhythm of daily life. Cathedrals were often the beating hearts of their cities. Inside, flickering candles, illuminated stone columns, carved with biblical scenes, while stained glass windows splashed colors across cold flagstones. Markets clustered around their squares, and pilgrims traveled long distances to kneel at relics, bringing wealth and cultural exchange. Skilled craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, and sculptors found steady work building these masterpieces, and their artistry inspired awe that transcended centuries. Even today, their towering vaults tell stories of faith, ambition, and community spirit. The streets beyond these cathedrals were equally vibrant. Taverns echoed with song and laughter, while traveling performers, jugglers, storytellers, and musicians entertained crowds. Feast days and festivals brought bursts of color and joy. Banners flapped in the wind. Musicians marched through streets and guilds, paraded proudly behind their crests. Midsummer fairs filled the air with the smell of roasting meat, sweet pastries, and exotic spices as merchants displayed silks and trinkets from distant lands. Religion intertwined seamlessly with entertainment. Mystery plays, performed in public squares, dramatized biblical stories for crowds who might never read a book in their lifetime. Art flourished in these bustling hubs. Wealthy merchants commissioned altarpieces, tapestries, and manuscripts, while artisans honed their crafts in guild workshops, passing knowledge through generations. Illuminated manuscripts, painstakingly created in scriptoriums, glimmered with gold leaf, their delicate artwork preserving both sacred texts and glimpses of daily life. Sculptors carved saints and kings into cathedral facades, their faces often modeled after real townsfolk, a subtle way of weaving the community into holy narratives. Architecture itself became a source of civic pride. Beyond churches, cities invested in bridges, town halls, and defensive towers. Stone-paved market squares became landmarks where proclamations were read, justice was served, and celebrations unfolded. City gates, often crowned with statues or coats of arms, reminded travelers that they were entering a powerful, wealthy domain. Inside the walls, buildings rose taller as demand for space grew. Timber-framed houses leaned precariously toward one another, creating narrow, shadowed alleys. The city was a patchwork of eras, every street corner whispering stories of expansion and adaptation. Education also flourished. Universities began to sprout in cities like Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, turning urban centers into intellectual havens. Students in robes crowded taverns and bookstalls arguing about philosophy and theology, while professors lectured in cold stone halls lit by candlelight. These schools became magnets for knowledge, drawing scholars from all over Europe and spreading ideas that would shape the Renaissance centuries later. Even amid poverty, grime, and disease, medieval cities radiated life. Picture a bustling evening. A minstrel strums a lute near a tavern, laughter spilling from within. A group of apprentices hurries past, carrying tools home from their master's shop. Bells ring for vespers, their echoes mingling with the distant bark of dogs and the clop of horses. Overhead, banners flutter in the night breeze, and somewhere high above, a gargoyle's stony gaze watches centuries slip by. These cities were not merely places to live, they were symbols of humanity's resilience, ambition, and creativity. Their legacy endures in towering cathedrals, crumbling stone walls, and the winding streets that still follow medieval footprints. Today, step through a medieval city gate in your mind, and you're not just walking into history, you're walking into the heartbeat of a world that built the foundations of modern life. As dusk deepens, the cathedral bells toll, summoning citizens to vespers. Their echoes roll across rooftops, blending with the chatter of taverns and the creak of wooden carts. The cathedral itself is a monument to ambition, its towering spire, visible from miles away, a constant reminder of both divine authority and civic pride. Inside, the scent of incense hangs heavy. Candles flicker against carved stone saints, and colored light from stained glass windows spills like liquid jewels onto the floor. The artistry of these buildings was unmatched, every gargoyle and vaulted arch a message carved into eternity. But the cathedral wasn't the only cultural gem. Mystery plays, performed in squares, dramatized scripture, while fairs blended religion with revelry. Jugglers, musicians, and acrobats entertained crowds alongside preachers delivering fiery sermons. City walls themselves became cultural landmarks, layered with history, Roman stones at the base, medieval battlements above graffiti, and heraldic shields etched into their surfaces. Universities added a hum of intellect to this lively world. Picture a candlelit lecture hall where scholars in long robes debate Aristotle while snow falls outside. Students huddled in unheated rooms, copying texts by hand, planting seeds of a renaissance that would one day reshape Europe. Medieval cities weren't merely places to survive. They were showcases of creativity, craftsmanship, and ambition. Even now, centuries later, their narrow lanes and towering spires whisper stories to anyone willing to wander slowly and listen. Picture a smoky tavern in the heart of a Roman town nearly 2,000 years ago. Oil lamps flicker on wooden beams overhead, illuminating a small stage where a comic actor in a painted mask performs for a crowd of merchants, soldiers, and citizens. His gestures are exaggerated. His voice rises and falls dramatically, and laughter ripples through the room. These performers, part of the thriving Roman theater tradition, are often considered the ancestors of the medieval jester, a link in a long unbroken chain of comedy and storytelling that winds through history. When the Roman Empire crumbled, its theaters fell silent. Roads grew overgrown, cities shrank, and Europe entered a time of fragmentation. Yet humor never vanished. Performers fled persecution and poverty, traveling along old Roman trade routes, carrying songs, jokes, and pantomimes to distant villages. Picture a lone figure in ragged clothes trudging down a muddy path, a lute slung over his shoulder, ready to trade laughter for a meal. These wandering entertainers were the seeds of a new tradition, one that would bloom centuries later in the bustling courts of kings and queens. By the early Middle Ages, each region had its own names for these performers: jongleurs in France, minnesingers in Germany, scops in England, and bards in Ireland. These titles reflected not just their humor, but their role as historians, musicians, and storytellers. In a world where literacy was rare, their words carried power. A minstrel's ballad could immortalize a knight's bravery, while a joke whispered at the right moment could save a life or end one. But it wasn't until the 12th and 13th centuries that the figure we now recognize as the jester truly emerged. The growing wealth of medieval courts created a demand for entertainment. Castles filled with nobles needed diversions from the heavy burden of politics and war. Imagine a great hall lit by dozens of torches, tapestries, swaying gently as servants scurry with goblets of wine. At the far end beneath a canopy, a king leans on one arm of his throne, his expression stern as his advisors whisper anxiously about battles and debts. Then, from a side door, a figure bursts in wearing a bright mismatched tunic. Bells on his cap jingle as he leaps into a somersault, drawing laughter from courtiers and even a faint smile from the weary king. The role of the jester was complex. He was both servant and sage entertainer and advisor. Court life was a delicate dance of power, where a misplaced word could spark war or treachery. Yet the jester had license to mock, tease, and speak truths no one else dared to utter. This privilege made him a paradoxical figure, both vulnerable and influential, both a fool and a voice of reason, cloaked in humor. Outside the royal courts, traveling jesters performed in marketplaces, inns, and village greens. They juggled knives for cheering crowds, told bawdy tales that made farmers roar with laughter, and sang ballads about kings and heroes. Some traveled with caravans of merchants, their performances turning dusty trade routes into temporary theaters. Others wandered alone, moving from city to city, their reputation spreading by word of mouth. The costume we associate with jesters, the motley tunic cap with bells and bauble staff, evolved over time. Early jesters might simply wear their everyday clothes or theatrical garb, but as their role became formalized, so did their attire. Bright colors and mismatched patterns symbolized their unpredictability, while bells announced their presence like a walking melody. The bauble, often topped with a carved head that resembled the jester himself, became both a prop and a symbol of his wit, a fool holding a fool. Jesters were not unique to Europe. In China's Tang dynasty, imperial jesters like Yu Se were renowned for using humor to gently critique emperors. In India, court jesters held a respected place, often advising kings through clever riddles and satire. Humor, it seems, was a universal language, and jesters were its ambassadors. Imagine stepping into a medieval court on a winter's evening. The hall is alive with sound dogs, barking at the edge of the room, servants clattering platters of roasted venison, nobles laughing behind jeweled goblets. In this vibrant world of luxury and intrigue, the jester was both entertainment and relief, a burst of color in a sea of politics. He might leap onto the table to tell a joke, imitate a rival noble's pompous walk, or sing a ballad that made courtiers weep. But beneath the performance was a keen understanding of human nature and power dynamics. For peasants, jesters were symbols of hope, a reminder that even kings could be mocked. For nobles, they were a release valve, turning tension into laughter. And for themselves, jesters lived in a delicate balance. One misstep could turn favor into exile. Yet their legacy is enduring. In every carnival mask, in every comedian's sharp joke, in every satirical cartoon, today you can trace the spirit of those motley-clad performers who once danced through candlelit halls. This was the birth of the jester, a traveler, a trickster, a truth-teller, hidden behind laughter. As Europe's cities expanded and royal courts grew more elaborate, the jester became a fixture of medieval life, his bells ringing through history as both a song of joy and a whisper of wisdom. Picture a smoky tavern in the heart of a Roman town nearly 2,000 years ago. Oil lamps flicker on wooden beams overhead, illuminating a small stage where a comic actor in a painted mask performs for a crowd of merchants, soldiers, and citizens. His gestures are exaggerated, his voice rises and falls dramatically, and laughter ripples through the room. These performers, part of the thriving Roman theater tradition, are often considered the ancestors of the medieval jester, a link in a long and broken chain of comedy and storytelling that winds through history. When the Roman Empire crumbled, its theaters fell silent. Roads grew overgrown, cities shrank, and Europe entered a time of fragmentation. Yet humor never vanished. Performers fled persecution and poverty, traveling along old Roman trade routes, carrying songs, jokes, and pantomimes to distant villages. Picture a lone figure in ragged clothes trudging down a muddy path, a lute slung over his shoulder, ready to trade laughter for a meal. These wandering entertainers were the seeds of a new tradition, one that would bloom centuries later in the bustling courts of kings and queens. By the early Middle Ages, each region had its own names for these performers: jongleurs in France, minnesingers in Germany, Scops in England, and bards in Ireland. These titles reflected not just their humor, but their role as historians, musicians, and storytellers. In a world where literacy was rare, their words carried power. A minstrel's ballad could immortalize a knight's bravery, while a joke whispered at the right moment could save a life or end one. But it wasn't until the 12th and 13th centuries that the figure we now recognize as the jester truly emerged. The growing wealth of medieval courts created a demand for entertainment. Castles filled with nobles needed diversions from the heavy burden of politics and war. Imagine a great hall lit by dozens of torches, tapestries, swaying gently as servants scurry with goblets of wine. At the far end beneath a canopy, a king leans on one arm of his throne, his expression stern, as his advisors whisper anxiously about battles and debts. Then, from a side door, a figure bursts in, wearing a bright mismatched tunic. Bells on his cap jingle as he leaps into a somersault, drawing laughter from courtiers, and even a faint smile from the weary king. The role of the jester was complex. He was both servant and sage entertainer and advisor. Court life was a delicate dance of power, where a misplaced word could spark war or treachery. Yet the jester had license to mock, tease, and speak truths no one else dared to utter. This privilege made him a paradoxical figure, both vulnerable and influential, both a fool and a voice of reason, cloaked in humor. Outside the royal courts, traveling jesters performed at marketplaces, inns, and village greens. They juggled knives for cheering crowds, told bawdy tales that made farmers roar with laughter, and sang ballads about kings and heroes. Some traveled with caravans of merchants, their performances turning dusty trade routes into temporary theaters. Others wandered alone, moving from city to city, their reputation spreading by word of mouth. The costume we associate with jesters, the motley tunic cap, with bells and bauble staff, evolved over time. Early jesters might simply wear their everyday clothes or theatrical garb, but as their role became formalized, so did their attire. Bright colors and mismatched patterns symbolized their unpredictability while bells announced their presence like a walking melody. The bauble, often topped with a carved head that resembled the jester himself, became both a prop and a symbol of his wit, a fool holding a fool. What made the jester special was not just humor, but timing and courage. In a tense council meeting where nobles debated war, a well-placed joke could diffuse anger. Imagine a king scowling at bad news, his temper rising. The room is silent. No one dares speak until the jester casually strolls in, pretending to trip over his own shoe, sending courtiers into laughter. The king's anger softens. The mood shifts. In a world where truth was often dangerous, jesters were rare voices who could speak it safely, their humor a shield and a sword. Jesters were not confined to Europe. In China's Tang dynasty, imperial jesters like Yu Si became legends, known for cleverly correcting emperors with humor rather than confrontation. In India, court jesters were advisors, storytellers, and philosophers in disguise. This universality shows that every culture valued laughter not just as entertainment, but as wisdom. Imagine stepping into a medieval court on a winter's evening. The hall is alive with sound, dogs barking at the edge of the room, servants clattering platters of roasted venison, nobles laughing behind jeweled goblets. In this vibrant world of luxury and intrigue, the jester was both entertainment and relief, a burst of color in a sea of politics. He might leap onto the table to tell a joke, imitate a rival noble's pompous walk, or sing a ballad that made courtiers weep. But beneath the performance was a keen understanding of human nature and power dynamics. For peasants, jesters were symbols of hope, a reminder that even kings could be mocked. For nobles, they were a release valve, turning tension into laughter. And for themselves, jesters lived in a delicate balance. One misstep could turn favor into exile, yet their legacy is enduring. In every carnival mask, in every comedian's sharp joke, in every satirical cartoon today, you can trace the spirit of those motley-clad performers who once danced through candlelit halls. They weren't just entertainers. They were historians, therapists, and truth-tellers, weaving wisdom into laughter. When you hear the faint jingle of bells in a painting or see a colorful cap in a museum, imagine the courage it took to wear it. A jester's laughter wasn't mindless. It was sharp, clever, and often revolutionary. That is why their legend survives, ringing softly through time, like bells echoing in a long torchlit hall. Step into a medieval royal court on a winter's night, and you'll find a world humming with tension beneath its grandeur. Torches flicker against stone walls. Tapestries depicting saints and legendary battles ripple gently in the smoky air, and nobles, clad in silk and velvet, lean close over goblets of spiced wine. The king sits at the far end of the hall, on a carved oak throne, his expression unreadable as advisors whisper urgent news. And then, breaking the heavy atmosphere, comes a cheerful jingle of bells. A figure bursts into the hall, clad in motley colors so bright they seem to glow in the torchlight. He cartwheels across the rush-strewn floor, bows with exaggerated grace, and launches into a bawdy ballad that sends courtiers roaring with laughter. This is the jester's magic, a single performer who can shift the energy of an entire room. But his job was far more complex than making nobles chuckle. Jesters were storytellers, historians, diplomats, and even unofficial therapists. Kings often confided in them, knowing they could speak candidly where even trusted advisors could not. This unusual role gave jesters a curious mix of privilege and danger. They enjoyed access to royal secrets, but lived one joke away from disaster. A skilled jester knew how to read the mood of a court. During tense negotiations, he might tell a parable to ease tempers. At banquets, he performed somersaults, juggled knives, or played musical instruments to delight guests. In quieter moments, he recited poetry, chronicling the lineage of his master's house, or immortalizing recent victories in song. Jesters were often walking archives, carrying in their memory stories of kings and kingdoms, serving as living historians in an age when few could read. Their performances weren't limited to royal halls. Traveling jesters, sometimes called minstrels or jongleurs, brought entertainment to towns and villages, performing in bustling market squares. Picture a cobblestone plaza on a bright spring morning. Traders hawking cloth and spices, children darting between stalls, and a crowd forming around a brightly dressed performer balancing on a barrel. He plucks a lute and begins to sing a tale of knights and dragons, adding comical twists that make the audience roar with laughter. Coins clink into his cap, tossed by merchants and peasants alike. For many rural folk, this was their only taste of theater news or satire. Being a traveling jester was a hard life. Roads were dangerous with bandits and wolves lurking beyond the city gates. Performers often traveled in groups for safety, forming troupes that combined music, acrobatics, and storytelling. They slept in inns or barns, relying on their wits to earn food and shelter. Yet this itinerant lifestyle also made them invaluable messengers. Long before newspapers, jesters carried news between towns, weaving current events into their songs and jokes. A performance might include veiled commentary on politics, subtly mocking unpopular taxes or leaders, much to the delight of common folk. Back at court, jesters played an entirely different role. Kings valued them not just for humor, but for insight. A well-placed joke could expose hypocrisy or highlight flaws in a policy without offending the monarch. Consider the famous story of Roland le Farter Jester to Henry VI of England, who used humor so effectively that he was rewarded with a manor, or Yu Se, a jester in China's Han Dynasty, who cleverly used jokes to convince Emperor Shi Huangdi to abandon a dangerous policy. In an era of absolute power, jesters were some of the few who could criticize authority, safely hiding wisdom in laughter. Jesters were also deeply skilled artists. They could juggle flaming torches, perform sleight of hand, or mimic accents and gestures of prominent courtiers. Some were ventriloquists or puppeteers, their little wooden dolls echoing their master's wit. A single evening's performance might include juggling a comedic skit, a heartfelt ballad, and a sharp piece of satire. Their diversity of talent was essential for a court's appetite for entertainment was insatiable. Nobles wanted to be surprised, delighted, and sometimes scandalized. The jester's place in society was paradoxical. On one hand, they were servants. Their antics often ridiculed their bright clothes, marking them as other. On the other, they had influence. A jester could whisper truths in a monarch's ear when no one else dared, and kings often trusted them as sounding boards for difficult decisions. Some jesters even accompanied rulers into battle, lifting morale and carrying messages between commanders. Their colorful garb made them conspicuous on the battlefield, A reminder of their unique status, jesters were considered sacred and traditionally spared, though history records that this was not always honored. Outside the courts, jesters were cultural bridges. They mingled with peasants and nobles alike, moving between social classes with ease. This gave them a unique perspective, allowing them to shape public opinion. Through humor, they could criticize injustices, mock corruption, or celebrate heroes, influencing how people viewed their rulers. In this way, they were early satirists, using laughter as a tool for subtle resistance and change. Imagine a medieval banquet tables laden with roasted meats, pitchers of ale, and sweetmeats imported from distant lands. Courtiers laugh their rings glinting in the candlelight as the jester performs a daring acrobatic stunt. Then, without warning, he begins a somber ballad about a fallen knight, his clear voice echoing through the hall. The laughter fades, replaced by a solemn hush. In this moment, he controls the emotional heartbeat of the entire court, shifting from humor to tragedy with ease. This mastery of tone was the hallmark of a great jester. Their artistry extended beyond performance. Some jesters became trusted advisors, wielding soft power in politics. Others became legends for their wit, like Triboulet Jester to King Francis III of France, whose cleverness reportedly saved his life when he angered the king. These stories cemented the jester's image. As more than a fool, he was a sage in disguise, a mirror reflecting truth back at those in power. For common folk, encountering a jester in the marketplace was a rare joy. Children clutched their mothers' skirts as they watched tumbling tricks. Merchants paused their haggling to laugh at a well-timed joke. In a time when life was harsh and uncertain, jesters brought moments of levity, a reminder that even in an age of plague and war, laughter could thrive. Close your eyes and hear it, the soft jingle of bells, the strum of a lute, and a burst of laughter echoing through a torchlit hall. The jester bows deeply, his cap's bells tinkling like tiny chimes. He is both entertainer and truth-teller, beloved, and mocked a performer who carries wisdom beneath his motley colors. His presence is a reminder that in every age, humor is not just escape, it's power, and those who wield it well can shape history as surely as kings. In the glow of a medieval torchlit hall, a hush falls over the crowd. A jester steps forward, his motley coat, swinging bells chiming softly. Yet this one is different. His gait uneven, his stature small, his face marked by a natural deformity that draws both curiosity and pity. This is what chroniclers called a natural fool, a person whose unusual appearance or mental state made them an object of fascination in the medieval imagination. Unlike licensed or artificial jesters, skilled performers who trained for their craft, natural fools were often born into misfortune, yet they found a strange kind of security and fame within noble courts. Medieval society viewed disability and difference through a lens of superstition and theology. A child born with a crooked spine, a limp, or an unusual face might be seen as touched by God, either blessed or cursed. For poor peasant families, raising such a child could be a financial strain. Survival alone was difficult, and a disabled child might require care that parents simply couldn't afford. Nobles and wealthy households sometimes adopted these individuals, taking them into their service as court entertainers. The position was not entirely altruistic. It was entertainment at the expense of the unusual, but for many natural fools it meant safety, shelter, and a purpose in a world that offered them few choices. Picture a medieval castle courtyard on a frosty morning. Servants scurry with buckets of water, stable boys lead horses, and among them waddles a dwarf jester in a brightly colored tunic, his bells jingling as he greets each passerby. His place in the household is secure. He eats at his master's table, enjoys warm clothing, and sleeps in relative comfort. Yet behind the laughter he provokes is a darker truth. His value lies in the amusement he provides. When he no longer entertains, he risks being cast out left to wander the streets or beg at church doors. Natural fools were a source of fascination for nobles because they broke the mold of an ordered hierarchical society. In an age obsessed with symmetry, beauty, and divine order, a person who defied these norms became a symbol of both humor and mystery. Some were kept almost as curiosities, their lives chronicled in household records alongside falcons hunting dogs and exotic animals. Yet others became beloved companions, their innocence softening the hearts of hardened rulers. There are tales of kings who confided deeply in their natural fools, finding comfort in their simplicity and loyalty. By contrast, licensed or artificial fools were trained entertainers. They honed their craft over years, mastering juggling acrobatics, music mimicry, and satire. Their costumes were intentionally chaotic, a riot of colors and patterns meant to symbolize unpredictability. They carried props like the bauble, a mock scepter topped with a carved head, often styled to resemble their own, and sometimes wielded padded clubs or inflated bladders for comic effect. Licensed jesters were often fiercely intelligent, hiding razor-sharp political commentary beneath their humor. The two types of jesters often shared the same courts, representing two sides of the same coin, one valued for wit and artistry, the other for uniqueness and innocence. Some noble households collected both types, using them for very different purposes. Licensed fools might tease a duke for his vanity or cleverly highlight flaws in policy, while natural fools entertained with physical humor or endearing behavior, sometimes becoming favorites of noble children. Yet the lives of natural fools were fraught with vulnerability. Many came from impoverished families who willingly gave them up, hoping they would be cared for in wealthier households. When they ceased to amuse, they were often cast aside. Some became beggars, their bright motley rags fading as they wandered market squares, jingling bells for coins. Others found refuge in monasteries or among traveling performers, where their differences were accepted, even celebrated. This fascination with physical difference wasn't unique to Europe. In courts across Asia and the Middle East, dwarfs and individuals with disabilities often held special positions, sometimes revered as symbols of divine humor or mystery. In the Byzantine Empire, emperors employed dwarf jesters in elaborate ceremonies, dressing them in jewel-encrusted costumes. Across cultures, rulers seemed drawn to those who defied physical norms, perhaps because their presence served as a reminder of life's unpredictability, even for kings. The medieval fascination with fools was also spiritual. In Christianity, the figure of the holy fool emerged, someone who rejected societal norms to live a life of humility, often appearing mad but revered for wisdom. Some natural fools were seen through this lens, their simplicity viewed as a kind of divine insight. Stories circulated of fools delivering cryptic warnings, or unintentionally speaking truths that proved prophetic. In an era when superstition and faith intertwined deeply, such moments carried weight. Licensed fools, though more respected professionally, faced their own risks. Their privilege to mock kings was double-edged. A clever joke could earn rewards, land gold, even titles, but a miscalculated jest could cost them their position or life. Chronicles tell of jesters who overstepped, delivering satire too sharp and were banished or executed. It was a high-stakes performance, art one where every word mattered. Imagine a winter evening in a grand hall. The fire roars in a massive stone hearth. Courtiers huddle in cloaks, and a licensed fool strides forward, lute in hand. He launches into a satirical song about a failed campaign, slipping sharp truths between rhymes. Nobles glance nervously at the king, but the monarch bursts out laughing. The tension breaks, and the fool bows low, his heart pounding. He has survived another night in the dangerous game of courtly humor. Meanwhile, a natural fool sits quietly by the fire, humming softly, offering a moment of peace in a hall filled with scheming. For all the grandeur of castles, these fools humanized royalty. They reminded kings and queens of vulnerability, innocence, and the power of laughter. Their legacy is bittersweet. Some became legends, immortalized in art and chronicles. Others vanished into obscurity, their stories lost to time. But both natural and licensed fools reveal something profound about medieval society, that humor, wit, and difference had a place even in the most rigid hierarchies. Kings wielded swords and crowns, but jesters wielded something subtler, a mirror reflecting truths that power often preferred to ignore. Even now, centuries later, the figure of the fool endures. In carnival masks and theater, in satire, their spirit lives on. They remind us that wisdom often wears a disguise, and that sometimes the simplest laugh carries the sharpest insight. Picture a medieval throne room, its stone walls echoing with the faint rustle of silk gowns and the clink of armor. Courtiers stand in clusters, whispering in low voices, their eyes darting nervously toward the king, seated on his high-backed chair. A map of contested territories lies spread on a table, candles dripping wax onto its edges as advisors argue in hushed tones. The atmosphere is heavy, thick with tension. Then the jingle of bells breaks the silence. A man in a motley tunic strides in confidently, his grin wide and mischievous. All eyes turn. This is the jester, a fool by title, but a master of timing. He bows, theatrically leaps onto a bench, and delivers a biting quip about the king's latest failed siege. Gasps ripple through the room, but instead of fury, the king laughs. The tension dissolves, if only for a moment. This was the essence of the jester's privilege, a unique form of power in medieval courts. Unlike anyone else, the jester had license to speak freely, mocking kings, dukes, and bishops with relative safety. It was a strange immunity, one that made him both invaluable and dangerous. In a world where words could condemn a man to death, the jester's humor became a subtle but potent political weapon. A skilled jester was more than an entertainer. He was a trusted advisor. Kings valued him because he could say what no one else dared. In a court where nobles flattered and schemed, the jester cut through pretenses with sharp wit. His role wasn't simply to make the monarch laugh, but to offer perspective often cloaked in satire. A jester's joke might seem harmless, but beneath the laughter there was wisdom. One famous story illustrates this power. In 1340, King Philip VI of France awaited news of his navy. When his fleet was destroyed at the Battle of Slees, no one dared break the news. It fell to his fool, who cleverly remarked that the English were cowards for refusing to jump into the sea, like the king's own sailors, who had leaped overboard in defeat. Philip understood the bitter truth wrapped in humor and accepted the news with grim amusement. In this way, jesters acted as mediators, softening devastating truths with laughter. The privilege extended beyond courtly gossip. Jesters could influence policy, temper anger, or even prevent rash decisions. Their humor was like a safety valve, releasing pressure in volatile environments. When a king's temper flared, jesters distracted him with songs or jokes, preventing dangerous outbursts. Some chroniclers speculate that jesters saved countless lives, not by wielding swords, but by wielding laughter. The privilege was not absolute, however. Jesters walked a razor's edge. A joke too sharp could end careers or lives. Triboulet, the jester of King Francis V of France, once offended his master deeply. Facing execution, he cleverly requested to choose his own death, saying, "By old age." The king, amused, spared him. Stories like this highlight both the danger and the brilliance of Jester's survival, depended on wit charm and perfect timing. The jester's influence extended beyond politics into diplomacy. Kings often sent their jesters on delicate missions because their eccentricity made them appear harmless. Their bright costumes and comic behavior allowed them to approach rival courts with messages or negotiate on their master's behalf. Some were even present during treaty negotiations, providing levity during tense discussions. Imagine two kings glowering at each other across a banquet table, their advisors whispering strategy, and between them stands a fool with bells, cracking jokes, until both rulers smile. Jesters also shaped public opinion. Traveling performers brought satire to marketplaces, subtly critiquing taxation or policies. They became a voice for commoners, mocking nobility in a way that entertained peasants and perhaps pricked the conscience of rulers. Their songs and rhymes spread quickly, carrying messages from city to city faster than official proclamations. In this sense, jesters were early journalists, their humor a tool for commentary. Their political role was so recognized that some jesters were considered part of a ruler's council. Will Somers, jester to Henry VIII of England, was present during important court meetings, trusted for his honesty and insight. Chroniclers recorded that Henry, known for his volatile temper, listened to Somers more than many noblemen. Somers' gentle humor reportedly calmed the king, offering a rare reprieve in a court filled with intrigue and fear. The jester's privilege also had symbolic significance. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical, but the jester embodied chaos within an order. His motley outfit, mismatched and colorful, was a reminder that truth could come from unlikely places. In a hall filled with armored knights and richly dressed courtiers, the fool's bells jingled like a soft rebellion, signaling that even kings were not beyond mockery. This paradox gave the jester power no weapon could match. He could whisper hard truths in a monarch's ear without punishment. Though his safety always hung by a thread, nobles envied him, yet often feared him, for his humor could could tarnish reputations or expose secrets. A joke told at the right time could undermine a rival's standing. A satirical ballad could immortalize a scandal. The jester was both clown and chronicler, recording history through laughter. Picture a royal feast. Long tables grown under roasted boar, sugared fruits, and golden goblets brimming with wine. Courtiers toast victories and alliances, but tension simmers beneath the merriment. Suddenly, the jester leaps onto the table, performing an impression of a pompous duke. Laughter erupts, but the duke flushes red, glancing nervously at the king. The monarch chuckles, giving permission for the ridicule to continue. In that moment, the fool asserts dominance over nobility, not through rank, but through wit. Their political relevance wasn't confined to palaces. In smaller courts, jesters played similar roles, advising barons and bishops, calming disputes, or negotiating between factions. Their neutrality, neither noble nor peasant, made them ideal mediators. A jester could stand in the middle of a feud, cracking jokes, until tempers cooled, and his status as a fool allowed him to say things no diplomat could risk. Even today, echoes of this privilege linger. Political cartoonists, satirists, and comedians inherit the jester's mantle, speaking truth to power under the protection of humor. The medieval fool jingling bells and torchlight was the prototype of this tradition, a reminder that laughter can be revolutionary. In an age where kings ruled by divine right, the jester was a subtle counterbalance, a voice that reminded rulers of their humanity. He wore chaos like a cloak, but carried wisdom in every jest. The motley costume, the bauble, the bells, all were masks, for a role more profound than any title. In the echoes of his laughter, history finds both a mirror and a warning. Even power needs humor to survive. Picture a medieval throne room, late in the evening. The fire in the grand hearth crackles, torches flicker, shadows across towering stone walls, and tapestries, depicting saints and battles, seem to sway gently in the smoky light. Courtiers stand in stiff circles, whispering behind jeweled fans, and ornate sleeves their glances sharp with calculation. The king, weary yet commanding, reclines on a throne of carved oak, its high back gleaming with gold leaf. Advisors argue in hushed tones over a map sprawled across a table, wax from dripping candles pooling at its edges. The tension is heavy, suffocating. Suddenly, a soft jingle echoes from the doorway. Heads turn. A man in motley colors steps into the hall with exaggerated grace, his bells chiming with each step. In this tense atmosphere, his arrival is like a sudden gust of fresh air. This is the jester's privilege, in action, a power so peculiar that only laughter could cloak it. No knight, duke, or bishop would dare mock the king, yet the fool could. He might bow low, then look the monarch straight in the eye, and quip about his latest defeat, or imitate a rival noble's pompous speech, provoking suppressed giggles from courtiers. In a world built on fear, the jester was an anomaly. He could tell the truth and live. Jesters became indispensable advisors because they offered honesty wrapped in humor. Nobility thrived on flattery, and kings often lived in echo chambers where no one dared speak freely. The fool's humor pierced this bubble, his jokes delivering truths in a way that entertained rather than insulted. A clever jester might save his monarch from a disastrous decision by disguising critique as comedy. Take Triboulet Jester to King Francis I of France. Known for his sharp wit, Triboulet once insulted a nobleman and was sentenced to death. But when asked to choose his method of execution, he quipped, "By old age." The king was so amused that he granted him a pardon. Stories like this immortalized jesters, not just as entertainers, but as masters of survival, their humor both armor and sword. Similarly in England, Will Somer's jester to Henry VIII earned his monarch's lifelong trust. Chroniclers record that Somers could soothe the notoriously volatile king with a few kind words or a well-timed jest. He even attended royal councils, often providing gentle wisdom when tempers flared. Somers' position was so secure that he appears in paintings alongside the royal family, a rare honor for someone of his rank. Jesters were not confined to Europe. In the courts of China, jesters like Yu Se wielded similar influence. Yu Si is remembered for cleverly convincing Emperor Shi Huangdi to abandon a dangerous project. Rather than openly challenge the emperor, Yu Si used humps to make him laugh at his own plan, a feat no advisor could have dared. In India, jesters were revered for their wisdom, often seen as philosophers disguised as fools. Across cultures, this figure recurs, the entertainer who masks insight beneath laughter. The privilege carried diplomatic weight as well. Jesters sometimes accompanied monarchs on journeys, or served as emissaries, their eccentricity disarming foreign rulers. Imagine two rival kings seated at a banquet, each guarded by suspicious advisors, and between them, a fool performs an impression of both sovereigns, drawing laughter from enemies and allies alike. In that laughter, tension softens, creating room for negotiation. Still, the privilege was fragile. A single ill-placed joke could lead to exile or worse. Chronicles are full of stories of jesters who pushed boundaries too far. Humor was a tightrope walk over a pit of swords. Survival required genius timing, a deep understanding of court politics, and the courage to speak truth while pretending to be harmless. In this way, jesters became mirrors of power. The motley costume itself symbolized chaos within order, a walking contradiction in a world obsessed with hierarchy. Bells jingled at every movement, drawing attention to the fool's every word. Yet his words cut through layers of pretense. In a sense, jesters embodied the voice of the people within the palace. They mocked kings, not only for amusement, but as a reminder that even rulers were mortal and fallible. Imagine a lavish banquet hall, tables laden with roasted boars, almond pastries, and goblets of spiced wine. Nobles whisper gossip, while musicians pluck lutes softly in the corner. Suddenly, the jester leaps onto the table, his bells chiming like chimes in the wind. He mimics a nobleman's pompous bow, then recites a limerick that slyly references a recent scandal. Laughter erupts, even from the king himself. But behind that laughter lies power. The jester has just humiliated a rival without raising a sword. Some jesters' influence rivaled that of advisors and generals. Their opinions shaped decisions, calmed tempers, and even saved lives. Chroniclers suggest that jesters often reminded kings of compassion. When anger threatened to spill into executions or wars, a well-placed joke could shift perspective. Laughter in the medieval court was a weapon as potent as any blade. Even outside royal circles, jesters influenced public sentiment. Traveling fools brought satire to marketplaces, embedding political commentary in their songs and skits. Peasants who rarely saw their rulers learned about court politics through these performers. A clever rhyme mocking a tax collector or corrupt noble spread like wildfire, becoming an early form of journalism. In this sense, jesters were both entertainers and messengers, their humor carrying news across kingdoms faster than official proclamations. The jester's privilege symbolized more than immunity. It represented a strange kind of trust. Kings understood that laughter could be a form of wisdom, and that their jester's honesty, though veiled in jokes, was a safeguard against arrogance. This tradition echoes today in political satire, comedians and cartoonists who continue the fool's role, speaking truth to power while cloaked in humor. Picture the throne room again, late at night. The king leans back weary from hours of counsel, and the courtiers shift nervously in their finery. The fool approaches bells, tinkling softly, and whispers something in the king's ear. A slow smile spreads across the monarch's face, and the room relaxes. That's the power of a jester, to pierce fear with laughter, to tame pride with wit, and to remind the mighty that even crowns are heavy. In a world where words could condemn a man, the fool lived by them. His laughter was a shield, his jokes a sword, and his presence a quiet rebellion in an age obsessed with power. That is why centuries later, we still remember their names, not as clowns, but as masters of truth, hidden behind painted smiles and jingling bells. Picture a grand medieval hall, illuminated by torchlight. The flickering flames cast golden halos over velvet draperies, and polished shields hung along the walls. Courtiers dressed in silks and furs stand in clusters, their clothing subdued in deep reds, blacks and golds, each color a mark of wealth and lineage. Into this solemn space bursts a riot of color, the jester. His motley coat stitched from mismatched panels of crimson emerald blue and yellow glows, as if he carries sunlight on his back. Bells, sewn into the tips of his sleeves, jingle softly as he spins the sound, both comical and mesmerizing. The contrast is deliberate. The jester is meant to be a living splash of chaos in a world obsessed with hierarchy and order. The motley costume became the jester's most defining feature, though its origins were practical. In an age when most clothing was dyed with natural pigments, muted browns, greens, and blues, bright clashing colors signaled extravagance. Only the wealthy could afford richly dyed fabrics, so a jester's motley coat, though comic, was also expensive. It symbolized his status as a servant of the court, funded by royal patronage. Each patch of cloth, stitched together like a patchwork quilt, became a visual metaphor for the jester himself, a mix of contradictions. A fool who was wiser than many nobles. His headgear was equally iconic. Early jesters sometimes shaved their heads, completely exaggerating their features for comic effect. By the 13th century, the jester's hood evolved into a coxcomb cap, a cloth hood with 3 long flaps representing donkey ears, or a rooster's comb, each tipped with a bell. These bells jingled with every movement, ensuring no entrance went unnoticed. The sound became his heraldry. Courtiers often recognized a fool by the merry chime of his approach before they saw his face. The jester also carried a bauble, a small staff topped with a carved head, often modeled after himself. This miniature figure, sometimes grotesque or comical, was a prop for jokes and mimicry, allowing the fool to speak through it, mock courtiers, or deliver commentary in a disguised voice. Some baubles were decorated with jewels or embroidery, making them as ornate as any noble's scepter. In many ways, the bauble symbolized the jester's role as a mirror. He used it to reflect others' vanity and folly, holding up a caricature of the court for all to see. Other props added to the humor. Some jesters wielded inflated pig bladders tied to sticks, which they playfully smacked against nobles' heads during performances, provoking laughter without offense. Others carried wooden swords or oversized spoons, parodying the weapons and tools of knights and servants. These props were not only comedic, but theatrical, turning the jester's entire body into a stage where satire came alive. Even the way jesters dressed was a form of commentary. In a society where fashion reflected power, their clothes mocked the seriousness of courtly attire, while dukes and ladies wore gowns with precise tailoring. The fool's motley was deliberately chaotic, a reminder that beneath the pomp and ceremony, humans were still prone to folly. Some historians believe that the motley design was inspired by medieval depictions of devils and tricksters, reinforcing the idea that the fool represented a necessary chaos within divine order. Yet not all jesters dressed alike. Traveling jesters who performed in marketplaces and village squares often wore simpler, more practical clothing, boots for long journeys, cloaks for yet weather, and bright scarves or hats to catch attention. Their motley garb was often second-hand or patched together from scraps, but this didn't make it less effective. A splash of red cloth or a jingling bell was enough to draw a crowd in a world where most peasants wore plain wool or linen. For natural fool, those employed for their unusual appearance or disabilities costumes were sometimes designed to exaggerate their features. This may seem cruel to modern sensibilities, but in medieval times, difference was seen as both humorous and mystical. Some dwarfs at court wore miniature suits of armor parading alongside knights during tournaments, while others dressed in jewel-encrusted finery becoming prized pets of royalty. These displays, though exploitative, also granted such individuals status protection and a measure of influence in a dangerous world. Props and costumes weren't just for show. They played psychological roles. The sound of bells, for example, wasn't merely comic, it commanded attention. In a bustling great hall filled with chatter, clinking goblets, and barking hounds, the soft jingle of bells signaled that the fool was about to perform. The bells created an auditory halo around the jester, making him seem omnipresent, even ethereal. Some chroniclers note that the bells served as a reminder of humility. In medieval Christianity, fools and jesters were often compared to holy men who rejected worldly pride. The visual symbolism of the jester also held deeper meaning. His motley costume made him impossible to mistake for anyone else, marking him as a safe target for jokes and mockery. This was important in a rigidly stratified society where offending the wrong noble could cost a man his life. By drawing ridicule to himself, the fool created a space where laughter was safe, a rare thing in a world where missteps were often fatal. His appearance served as a lightning rod for tension, making him indispensable in courtly life. Imagine standing in a medieval marketplace on a festival day. A traveling jester arrives, his bells jingling softly as children run to greet him. He flips a wooden staff topped with a grotesque, carved head, making it speak in a squeaky voice, mocking the town mayor. Peasants roar with laughter, and even the mayor chuckles, knowing the fool's humor is a tradition as old as kingship itself. In that moment, his costume and props become more than tools of entertainment. They are instruments of connection, uniting villagers and nobles in shared amusement. Over time, the jester's imagery became iconic in European art and literature. Medieval manuscripts often depicted fools with exaggerated hoods and comical expressions, symbolizing satire and folly. Renaissance paintings elevated them to complex figures, clowns who laughed outwardly while hiding wisdom or sorrow within. Even today, their image survives in playing cards, theater masks, and carnival costumes, proof of their enduring legacy. Their attire was as much armor as decoration, while knights wore steel plate to deflect arrows. Jesters wore humor to deflect anger. Each bell patch of fabric and carved bauble was part of an elaborate defense system, a way to entertain, disarm, and survive in a world of intrigue. In that sense, their motley was a uniform of resilience, its cheerful colors hiding the sharp mind beneath. Close your eyes and imagine stepping into a medieval hall filled with torchlight and music. Among the rustle of silks and the gleam of jewels, a figure in bright motley dances lightly, bells chiming with every step. He wields a bauble like a miniature scepter, parodying the grandeur around him, and yet all eyes are on him. That's the paradox of the jester. Though he was the lowest ranking person in the room, his costume made him the brightest star in it. Imagine stepping into a medieval tailor's shop, deep within the bustling heart of a castle's courtyard. The smell of lanolin from raw wool mingles with the sharp tang of vinegar used to set dyes. Bolts of cloth scarlet, indigo forest green, and butter yellow are stacked on wooden shelves, precious as treasure. A seamstress bends over a table, scissors clinking as she cuts triangles of contrasting colors, carefully piecing together the puzzle that will become a jester's motley. This garment is not merely clothing, it is a costume designed to captivate an advertisement of the jester's unique role. Bright dyes were expensive in the Middle Ages. Indigo came from far-off India, crimson from crushed cochineal insects or madder roots, and yellow from weld plants, carefully cultivated by dyers. Each color told a story of trade routes stretching across continents, and wearing them together was both a privilege and a parody. For a noble, wearing crimson or lapis blue signaled wealth. For a jester, combining all these colors in one coat turned status symbols into a chaotic joke. His very presence mocked the seriousness of fashion in court, and yet his clothes were often better made than those of peasants, stitched with expert hands and lined for comfort. The making of a jester's hood was a process of artistry. The famous coxcomb, or ass's ears, were carefully stuffed to stand upright, each tipped with a bell that rang at the slightest movement. Bells were hand-cast in bronze or brass, polished until they gleamed, and some were engraved with tiny patterns. Courtiers often recognized a jester by the unique tone of his bells, each set creating a personal soundtrack for its wearer. Children loved these bells, chasing jesters down corridors to make them jingle, while nobles associated them with levity, a reminder that even solemn halls had space for laughter. the bauble was just as symbolic. Some were simple wooden sticks with a carved head. Others were miniature works of art with painted faces, tiny caps, and embroidered collars. In paintings and manuscripts, jesters are often depicted holding their bauble upright like a mock scepter, a parody of the king's authority. In performances, the bauble often became a character of its own speaking, in a squeaky voice, insulting courtiers, or acting as a devilish conscience to the jester. Props were crucial to a jester's stagecraft. Inflated pig bladders, tied to sticks, were lightweight, yet noisy perfect for playful antics during feasts. Some jesters wielded mock weapons, enormous spoons or puppets, turning every object into comedy gold. Others used costumes creatively hiding small items in their sleeves or bells pulling coins from nowhere or producing juggling balls from hidden pouches. The jester's wardrobe was essentially a portable theater. Traveling jesters adapted their outfits for life on the road. Unlike their courtly counterparts, they couldn't carry entire wardrobes. Instead, they wore simpler clothes, motley tunics, patched from leftover fabric, sturdy leather boots, and wide belts to hold tools of the trade flutes, juggling balls or knives. Despite their modest appearance, these outfits were as recognizable as a herald's uniform. When a traveling fool arrived in a village square, his colorful attire was enough to draw a curious crowd. For dwarfs and natural fools, costumes were often extravagant, though the intent was more to amuse than to empower. Noble families might dress them in jewel-encrusted robes or armor scaled down to fit their size, parading them at tournaments like mascots. This treatment, though exploitative, also protected them. In a dangerous world where disability often meant abandonment, these individuals enjoyed food, clothing, and a measure of respect, though their dignity was often the price. Symbolism infused every part of a fool's costume. In medieval Christianity, the fool was seen as a necessary inversion of order, a reminder of humility. Bells, for example, echoed those worn by lepers and animals, a subtle symbol of marginalization turned into power. The motley design, chaotic yet deliberate, mirrored the jester's paradoxical role, a fool who could speak wisdom, a servant who could chastise a king. Art from the period often depicts jesters crouching in corners, observing scenes silently, their bright clothes emphasizing their outsider status, even when they were central to court life. Picture a feast day in a bustling city square. Flags snap in the breeze. Vendors sell roasted chestnuts and sugared almonds, and jugglers perform for coins. Suddenly, a jester emerges from the crowd, his motley costume glittering in the sunlight. He twirls his bauble, making its tiny head speak, and children squeal with laughter. Even peasants weary from labor smile at his antics. His bright colors stand out against the dull earth tones of villagers' tunics and aprons, making him a beacon of joy in a gray world. Costume also provided safety. In a time when social classes were rigid, a jester's uniform gave him a kind of immunity. Nobles could laugh at his jokes, knowing he was only a fool, while guards and servants recognized his special status instantly. The jester's bells served as both an introduction and a warning. His words, though humorous, might carry weight. A mocking verse could humiliate a duke. A clever rhyme could immortalize a scandal. His costume announced that he played by different rules, protected by tradition, yet constantly at risk. Artists immortalized this image in manuscripts, woodcuts, and paintings, In medieval marginalia, those whimsical illustrations in illuminated manuscripts, jesters often appear cavorting among saints, knights, and beasts, a playful reminder that humor was as integral to life as faith. Renaissance painters deepened this portrayal, capturing jesters with melancholy expressions beneath their colorful garb, emphasizing their role as truth-tellers in disguise. Even playing cards carry this legacy. The Joker, with his bells and staff, is a direct descendant of the medieval fool. Modern audiences might see the motley as simple costume, but to medieval people, it was deeply symbolic. The combination of chaotic colors, jingling bells, and satirical props reflected a profound truth that laughter was a powerful force capable of humbling kings and comforting peasants alike. The fool's attire was theatrical armor, allowing him to say things no one else dared. Imagine standing at the edge of a royal banquet, watching a fool weave through the crowd. The golden light of chandeliers glints off his bells. The bauble's painted eyes seem to follow you, and his bright clothing reflects in polished goblets. He stops, suddenly locks eyes with a duke, and delivers a perfectly timed joke that sends the hall into laughter. In that moment, his costume is more than clothing. It is a sting, a shield, and a crown all in one. Close your eyes and step into a medieval banquet hall on the night of a great feast. The long oak tables are lined with trenchers of roasted venison, golden pastries, and steaming stews, while the air hums with the low murmur of nobles in velvet gowns and knights in gleaming mail. Candles flicker in iron sconces, shadows dance along stone walls, and a harp's delicate notes drift softly from a corner. Suddenly, a trumpet blares, and into this rich, solemn world strides the jester. He bows low, bells chiming, and with a snap of his fingers transforms the hall into a theater of laughter, music, and awe. Jesters were artists of many disciplines, blending music, acrobatics, mime, storytelling, and satire into a single performance. Unlike modern comedians, who specialize in stand-up, the medieval fool was a one-man troupe carrying centuries of oral tradition in his memory. His work was part circus, part concert, part political cartoon, and part therapy session for kings. Music was at the heart of his craft. Many jesters were gifted singers and instrumentalists skilled with lutes, harps, drums, or recorders. Their repertoires spanned bawdy drinking songs, romantic ballads, religious hymns, and heroic epics. A skilled fool could shift the mood of a hall with a single tune, a jaunty melody to make courtiers laugh, or a haunting lament that hushed even the noisiest feast. Music wasn't mere entertainment, it was a weapon. Through songs, jesters delivered biting commentary, embedding satire in rhymes that nobles might laugh at on the surface, but remember long after. Some jesters were acrobats of astonishing talent. Imagine one leaping onto a banquet table, somersaulting through the air, as goblets tremble before landing in a perfect bow. He spins juggling clubs lit with candles, the flames reflecting in the wide eyes of watching children. Acrobatics weren't just spectacle, they symbolized the fool's precarious life. Each leap mirrored his delicate dance. With danger in court politics, his skill kept him alive as much as his wit did. Mime and pantomime were equally important. In a time when few could read, physical humor was universal. Jesters could imitate a waddling goose mimic, a pompous bishop or act out entire battles, silently bringing laughter to audiences across languages and social classes. This universality made traveling fools especially effective, able to entertain villagers in remote hamlets as well as nobles in grand halls. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of their art was satire. Jesters were the political cartoonists of their day, weaving critique into comedy. A skilled fool could lampoon a duke's vanity or highlight a policy's absurdity without facing execution. The trick was balance humor softened the sting of truth. Many kings tolerated and even valued this honesty because it provided perspective no advisor dared give. Chronicles suggest jesters sometimes changed history by mocking reckless plans before they could be enacted. Picture a fool performing in front of a tense royal council. Nobles fidget as the king fumes over a costly defeat. The fool suddenly bursts into a mock reenactment, pretending to be the commander fleeing battle, tripping over his own boots. Laughter erupts and the king's rage cools. In that moment, humor diffuses political tension, saving reputations and perhaps even lives. Storytelling was another vital skill. Jesters memorized epic poems and folk tales, performing them with dramatic flair. In an age without printing presses, their voices preserved history. Tales of Charlemagne, King Arthur, and ancient heroes were passed down through their performances, becoming part of Europe's cultural memory. Their stories were embroidered with humor, wisdom, and moral lessons, turning each performance into both entertainment and education. Some jesters were masters of improvisation. At banquets, they might poke fun at a noble's new gown or improvise verses about events of the day. This quick wit made them valuable companions for kings who relied on jesters not just to entertain, but to lighten heavy moods. Imagine a royal hunting party resting under a tree, servants prepare wine, knights exchange gossip, and the jester, perched on a stump, spins a clever rhyme about the king's hunting dog making everyone laugh. This ability to create humor on the spot made jesters irreplaceable. Their performances also included illusion and sleight of hand. Some fools amazed audiences with simple magic tricks, making coins disappear, producing ribbons from their sleeves, or performing cup and ball games that baffled even sharp-eyed nobles. Combined with jokes and mimicry, these tricks added an air of mystery, making the jester seem both comical and cunning. Even their body language was a form of art. A mere tilt of the head, a raised eyebrow, or an exaggerated bow could provoke laughter. The fool's physicality was as important as his words. He was a living caricature, exaggerating the mannerisms of nobles, clergy, or foreign dignitaries. These parodies were often sharper than words exposing arrogance or hypocrisy through gestures alone. Traveling jesters often performed in open-air markets, transforming dusty squares into makeshift theaters. Picture villagers gathering around as a fool balances on a barrel lute slung across his back. He juggles apples, spins tales of far-off battles, and jokes about local gossip. Coins clink into his hat, and laughter echoes off timbered buildings. For peasants who rarely saw luxury or grandeur, the fool brought a taste of the wider world news and stories wrapped in humor. In large courts, jesters sometimes staged miniature plays with puppets or fellow performers. These plays mocked politics, clergy, and even royalty. The court's tolerance of such satire was a sign of sophistication. A wise king understood that laughter was not weakness, but a form of wisdom. However, this tolerance was fragile. One poorly timed joke could ruin a career or end a life. The fool walked a tightrope, using humor to survive in a deadly serious world. The art of the jester was also deeply emotional. Though known for laughter, they could bring a hall to tears. A fool might begin a feast with tumbling tricks, then quiet the room with a mournful ballad about a fallen knight or a famine-stricken village. His voice would echo through the stone hall, and even hardened nobles might wipe their eyes. This ability to evoke both joy and sorrow made jesters uniquely powerful. Their versatility extended to animals as well. Some jesters trained performing dogs or monkeys, adding exotic flair to their shows. These animals, dressed in tiny costumes, mirrored the chaos and humor of their masters. A monkey in motley might leap onto a duke's shoulder mid-feast, sending the hall into hysterics. Such antics broke down a rigid formality, humanizing even the most stoic rulers. Imagine sitting in a medieval hall after a long day of political intrigue. Candles flicker, and the smell of roasted meat lingers in the air. Suddenly, the fool somersaults into the center of the room, bells jingling juggling knives in a blur of light. Gasps fill the air, followed by applause. He then slips into a satirical verse about the king's tax collectors, making the monarch chuckle. In those moments, the fool isn't just entertainment. He's therapy relief and wisdom disguised as gag. Centuries later, this multifaceted artistry lives on in a circus. Performers, comedians, and satirists. The medieval fool laid the groundwork for modern entertainment, blending laughter with insight. His craft was an intricate tapestry woven from music, movement, and courage. A performance that could soothe anger, inspire compassion, and remind rulers of their humanity. The jester's art was his life. Every song, every tumble, every joke was a gamble. Yet he made his audience forget their worries, even if only for a night, proving that humor could be as powerful as any sword or crown. Let's drift back into the candlelit courts of kings and emperors, where whispers echoed against stone walls, and laughter often carried more power than a drawn sword. In this world of velvet, gowns, iron crowns, and flickering torchlight jesters walked a razor's edge, their bells chiming softly as they delivered words that could amuse or condemn. History has preserved their names like echoes in a grand hall. Some fools survived with wit, sharper than any blade, others with kindness, and some through sheer audacity that turned ridicule into legend. Imagine yourself in 16th century France. The palace corridors smell faintly of beeswax polish and burning tallow candles, the heavy scent mingling with cold winter air, seeping through arrow-slit windows. King Francis I, it reclines on a carved throne, his jewel-encrusted robes pooling at his feet, while courtiers stand stiff and silent, careful not to offend. Into this tension strolls Triboulet, the king's famous fool, his motley garb, a riot of color in a somber room. He bows with exaggerated grace, then delivers a jest so sharp it slices through the stillness, mocking a nobleman's arrogance. The hall erupts in laughter, but the insult lands hard, and soon Triboulet finds himself accused a death sentence hovering over his head. Summoned to choose the manner of his own execution, Triboulet kneels, tilts his head with feigned innocence, and says, "Sire, I choose to die of old age." The room holds its breath, then roars with laughter. Even Francis himself cannot suppress a smile, and with a wave of his hand, he spares Triboulet's life. That single joke outlived kingdoms whispered down through centuries, as proof that laughter can outwit death. Now, follow me across the channel into the court of Henry VIII of England, a place where fear and power hung thick as incense. Here lived Will Sommers, remembered not for biting satire, but for gentleness. He was not the fool who taunted kings, but the one who soothed them, whose calm humor softened Henry's infamous temper. Imagine him, a quiet man with kind eyes, kneeling at the king's bedside in his later years, when Henry's body ached and paranoia shadowed every waking hour. Sommers' presence was a comfort. He could joke about the king's weight or tease him about his hounds without fear. He was so beloved that artists painted him standing among the royal family, a rare honor for someone of his station. Sommers' legacy is a reminder that jesters weren't always clowns who mocked. Some wielded warmth as their sharpest tool, and in a court dripping with intrigue, his kindness was its own form of courage. But jesters weren't always subtle. Let's pause in 12th century England, where Roland Lefarter made history through one outrageous talent. Records describe him performing each Christmas for King Henry II, executing what became legendary, a leap, a whistle, and a fart, all performed simultaneously. It was crude, absurd, and utterly unforgettable. Yet Roland's antics earned him far more than applause. He was gifted 30 acres of land and a manor in Suffolk for his services. Though history now chuckles at his name, his story speaks volumes about medieval courts where humor, no matter how vulgar, was deeply valued. Even the most solemn kings craved laughter, and Roland's performance secured him wealth and immortality in England's chronicles. Let us journey even further eastward into ancient China, where another kind of fool walked among emperors. Yu Si Jester to the formidable Shi Huangdi lived in a world where a single misstep could mean death. Yet Yu Si wielded wit like a finely honed blade. Once, when the emperor proposed painting the Great Wall overnight, a plan so impossible that his court trembled, Yu Si broke the silence. Why not paint it bright red, so your enemies will see it from even further away? The room erupted in laughter. The emperor's anger dissolved, and the plan was abandoned. In that single jest, Yu Si saved countless workers from an impossible decree, proving that even in the presence of absolute power, humor could change the course of history. Back in Europe, the lives of jesters were not always filled with laughter. Triboulet himself, though clever and daring, was said to be haunted by melancholy. Artists often painted jesters not as cheerful clowns, but as men with sorrowful eyes behind their colorful garb, carrying the heavy knowledge that their survival depended on constant performance. And yet, these men and women remained indispensable, their laughter a balm in a harsh world. In some courts, fools accompanied rulers to battlefields carrying messages across lines, their motley outfits signaling a strange kind of immunity. Even in war, laughter was sacred. Not all jesters were men. In the court of Charles V of France, Archambault de Poix, a celebrated female fool, was richly dressed and deeply trusted. She was said to entertain queens and noble ladies, bringing levity into a world that often confined women to silence. In Burgundy, Margaret of Austria's female jester rode proudly in a carriage alongside her mistress, an unusual privilege in a society obsessed with rank. These stories remind us that the motley costume was sometimes a key to freedom, especially for women who might otherwise have been voiceless. Some jesters became legends in folklore, their antics immortalized in plays, poems, and paintings. The German jester Klaus Narr was so respected for his wisdom that his sharp parables earned him the nickname the philosopher fool. Chroniclers claimed he could predict events, his riddles baffling even scholars. Narr's life illustrates another truth. Jesters were not always jesters by nature. Many were scholars, musicians, or monks before taking up the motley. Their humor was a mask, but beneath it often lay keen intelligence. Imagine yourself wandering through a medieval festival. The scent of roasted meat and sweet honey cakes fills the air. Merchants shout over the clamor, and jugglers perform daring tricks. Suddenly, a story sweeps through the crowd, a noble's scandalous affair, a king's temper, or a tax collector's folly, all carried not by town criers, but by jesters. In a time without newspapers, fools were the gossip network, the satirists, the entertainers, and the keepers of truth. Their songs and jokes traveled faster than royal decrees, shaping public opinion in subtle ways. Every great jester walked a thin line. Triboulet survived because of sharp timing, Roland because of outrageous humor, Will Summers because of empathy. UC thrived in one of the most dangerous courts in history because he understood when to laugh and when to kneel. These stories form a tapestry of courage, cunning, and artistry. Behind the bells and bright colors were men and women who understood the true weight of their role to speak truth to power without losing their heads. Their legacy lives on, not just in dusty manuscripts or portraits hanging in palaces, but in every comedian, every satirical cartoon, every moment we use humor to challenge authority. The medieval fool was more than a clown. He was a cultural cornerstone, a mirror that reflected both the absurdity and brilliance of his age. Even now, if you close your eyes, you can almost hear them, the soft jingle of bells, the murmur of laughter in a torchlit hall, and a fool's voice bright and sharp, cutting through centuries like a silver blade of truth wrapped in joy. As the seasons shifted and winter's icy breath swept through medieval Europe, the presence of jesters became even more important. In a world where nights were long, food scarce, and illness common, laughter was not merely amusement, it was survival. Festivals, feast days, and seasonal celebrations offered brief reprieves from hardship, and the fool was at the very heart of these moments. His bells and bright colors broke the monotony of gray skies and the grim routines of labor, turning dark months into seasons of warmth and wonder. Close your eyes and imagine a frost-covered village square just after sunset. The air smells of wood smoke and roasting chestnuts, and lanterns sway gently on poles. Townspeople, wrapped in cloaks, gather around a makeshift stage where a jester stands, his motley costume glowing against the snow like a patch of spring in the dead of winter. He flips his bauble in the air, makes it speak in a squeaky voice, and bursts into a comic dance, bells jingling with every step. Children laugh and chase him, while weary farmers grin through chapped lips. In these moments, jesters weren't just entertainers. They were bringers of light, carrying warmth wherever they went. One of the most significant roles jesters played in cultural tradition was during the Feast of Fools, a medieval celebration that inverted society's hierarchy for a day. On this holiday, Bishops dressed as peasants, priests acted as fools and commoners, mocked their rulers without fear. The jester, already a living embodiment of chaos and inversion, became a symbol of this wild, liberating spirit. Imagine the chaos church bells ringing, not in solemn tones, but in joyful clamor, clergy dancing in the streets, villagers wearing masks and costumes, and jesters leading parades through towns. In these carnivalesque moments, laughter was sacred. It reminded communities that order and chaos, seriousness and joy were all threads in the same divine tapestry. Jesters also played crucial roles in Yuletide and Christmas festivities. Long before modern Christmas traditions, medieval households celebrated the 12 days of Christmas with elaborate feasts, games, and pageantry. The Lord of Misrule, often a jester or someone chosen from the lowest ranks, presided over these celebrations, commanding nobles to sing songs, play games, and obey ridiculous orders. Picture a stern duke forced to dance with a wooden spoon while servants laugh, or a queen laughing until tears fall as she's ordered to recite nursery rhymes. For one night, the jester's authority was absolute. This ritual inversion reminded everyone from peasants to kings that power was fleeting and laughter divine. In villages, traveling jesters and performers brought life to festivals marking the turning of the year, harvest fairs, spring celebrations, midsummer revels. Their jokes often tied to agricultural cycles, teasing farmers about their cows, or mimicking the way a blacksmith walked after a long day's work. These performances weren't just jokes. They carried tradition and folklore, passing down stories from generation to generation. A jester's silly rhyme about planting and reaping might actually contain wisdom encoded in humor so that peasants remembered when to sow, when into harvest, or how to prepare for winter. In some regions, fools and clowns were even part of religious plays performed during holidays. The mystery and miracle plays of medieval Europe often had comic interludes. Fools who stumbled onto a stage, cracked jokes, and mocked authority before vanishing, so priests could deliver solemn messages. This blend of reverence and humor was deeply medieval. Laughter wasn't seen as sinful, but as an essential part of spiritual life. Churches themselves sometimes employed parish jesters, individuals who performed at fairs and holy days, reminding the faithful that joy was a gift from God. Picture a cathedral square on Easter morning. The bells peal joyfully as crowds gather their breath, misting in the spring air. A troupe of jesters tumbles through the square, playing flutes and banging drums, their antics drawing children to the front of the crowd. Behind them, priests carry banners and candles, their solemnity balanced by the jester's exuberance. This marriage of humor and holiness was a hallmark of medieval life. Laughter and devotion weren't enemies, but partners, each deepening the other. Winter feasts in castles gave jesters opportunities to shine brightest. In drafty halls, warmed by great hearths, nobles sat shoulder to shoulder at trestle tables, candles flickering in iron chandeliers. The jester danced between courses, filling gaps between dishes with stories, juggling, and riddles. The scent of roasting boar and spiced wine mingled with laughter as he performed impressions of court officials, daring to mock even the king himself. These winter gatherings weren't just about indulgence. They were about morale. In a time when disease and famine loomed outside castle walls, jesters reminded everyone, rich and poor alike, that joy was a form of resistance against despair. Some festivals turned fools into powerful symbols. During Lent, jesters parodied priests in lively processions, singing mock hymns and carrying baubles like sacred relics. Their antics weren't acts of disrespect, but a reminder of humility. Even kings and clergy could be laughed at, for laughter was a form of truth. This blending of the sacred and the ridiculous made jesters unique cultural figures, straddling the line between reverence and rebellion. Jesters' songs preserved folklore too. Many of their verses, though silly on the surface, were coated with legends about local saints, mythical creatures, or historical battles. In villages where literacy was rare, a jester's performance was a living book, a memory passed down in rhyme. Around winter, hearth's peasants would repeat their jokes and stories, keeping oral tradition alive. The fool was a walking library, his humor the sugar coating over history's bitter pills. Even the seasons shaped their performances. In spring, jesters played with flowers and greenery, wearing wreaths on their motley hoods. In summer, they led processions through meadows, juggling apples and pears, their bells blending with birdsong. Autumn brought harvest jokes, songs about wine-making, and playful teasing of millers and bakers. Winter, with its biting cold and dark evenings, made their bright costumes and musical bells more precious than ever. In every season, they were a source of color and sound. In a world often muted by labor and hardship, imagine yourself standing at the edge of a snowy courtyard during Twelfth Night festivities. Torches burn bright, casting halos in the night air. A bonfire crackles in the center of the square, sparks flying upward like stars. The jester leads a chain of dancers, his bauble raised high like a mock scepter. Nobles laugh with peasants, children squeal with joy, and even the stern castle guards crack smiles. For a few hours, the rigid barriers of class blur, and the fool, so often dismissed as lowly, becomes the heart of the celebration. Centuries later, echoes of these festivals survive in modern carnivals, Mardi Gras parades, and New Year's celebrations. The vibrant costumes, masks, and street performers of today are descendants of medieval jesters and their feast day chaos. Their bells may have quieted, but the spirit of misrule, they embodied this joyful inversion of power. This reminder that laughter belongs to everyone still lingers in every party hat, every clown's grin, every parade float that glides through a cheering crowd. The fool's role in festivals reminds us that laughter was more than a pastime. It was medicine for a weary world. In a time when winters were harsh, life expectancy was short, and work was relentless. Jesters offered hope, wrapped in color and sound. They were the heartbeat of medieval celebrations, their humor, a kind of magic that stitched together faith and fun, sorrow and joy. If you listen closely, on a quiet winter night, you might still hear their bells carried faintly on the wind, a reminder that even in the darkest seasons, humanity has always danced and laughed its way back to light. And so, as we drift back from torchlit halls and snowy courtyards, the laughter of fools and the bustling hum of medieval cities fade softly into memory. These worlds, once alive with the clatter of hooves on cobblestone streets, the scent of roasting meat wafting through castle kitchens, and the chiming bells of motley-clad jesters were as vibrant and complex as our own lives today. City walls rose high protecting markets and homes, while laughter echoed within courts where jesters dared to speak truths that no knight or noble would utter. Festivals turned order upside down, bringing moments of joy and unity, and the fool's quick wit often softened the heavy weight of kingship, sometimes changing history with nothing more than a rhyme or a well-timed jest. Life in the Middle Ages was harsh and fleeting, yet it was also filled with color, faith, and resilience. The same streets where disease spread also carried merchants from far-off lands. The same halls where monarchs plotted war rang with jokes and stories that have survived centuries. These voices, preserved in parchment and legend, remind us that humor has always been a form of courage and laughter, a kind of rebellion against despair. As the fire dies down and the bells fall silent, we leave this chapter of history behind with a sense of warmth, because even in an age of iron and shadow, humanity found ways to laugh, love, and celebrate life. May their echoes follow you into your dreams tonight, soft and distant, like bells swaying in a midnight breeze.